Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we return with another chilling collection of forgotten accounts buried deep in the shadows of time. In this episode, we will dive deep into the heart of American small towns with 6 harrowing tales of the most disturbing true horror stories that have emerged from these seemingly quiet communities. Each narrative has been meticulously researched and reconstructed from first-hand testimonies of residents who lived through these terrifying experiences in places where everyone knows your name, but nobody knows your secrets. These are the confessions of ordinary people who witnessed extraordinary evil in towns, with populations that could fit in a high school gymnasium. To protect the identities of those involved, some names and locations have been carefully altered, but the core truth of each account remains intact. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning what really happens when the sun sets on small-town America. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the darkest files that small communities tried to bury forever. I delivered mail in Millfield for 12 years. And I thought I knew every secret in that town. When you walk the same routes day after day, season after season, you become part of the landscape. People wave from their windows, leave you cold drinks in summer, and shovel paths to their mailboxes in winter. You learn which houses get medical supply deliveries, which ones have college kids coming home, and which ones never seem to get anything but bills and catalogs. But there was something happening on Elm Street that took me 12 years to notice, and another 6 months to understand. Millfield is the kind of place where 3,000 people call home, where Main Street has more empty storefronts than open businesses, and where everyone knows your business before you do. It sits in a valley between 2 hills, surrounded by maple forests that turn the whole town gold every October. The kind of place people drive through on their way to somewhere else, never stopping long enough to see what lurks beneath the surface. My route covered the whole town, but Elm Street was always my favorite. 12 houses lined up in a perfect row, each one built in the 1940s with identical front porches and small front yards. The residents were mostly older folks who had lived there for decades. Mrs. Patterson at number 4 always had her porch light on and would wave from her kitchen window. Mr. Rodriguez at number 8 kept the most immaculate garden I had ever seen. The Hendersons at number 12 had lived there since they were newlyweds in 1963. For 11 years, I delivered their mail without paying much attention to the details. Bills, magazines, the occasional package. Normal small-town postal delivery. But during my 12th year, something started nagging at me. It was March when I first noticed it, a subtle pattern that my subconscious had been tracking long before my rational mind caught up. Every 3rd Thursday of the month, without fail, each house on Elm Street received an identical package. Same size, same weight, same return address that I could never quite make out through the smudged ink. The packages were wrapped in brown paper, about the size of a hardcover book. And they always arrived on the same delivery truck from the regional sorting facility. 12 packages, 12 houses, every 3rd Thursday, like clockwork. At first, I assumed it was some kind of subscription service, maybe a book club or vitamin delivery. Small towns have their quirks, and if all the residents of one street wanted to order the same thing, that was their business. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. These people barely talked to each other. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen from number 6 had been in a property line dispute for 15 years. The Rodriguezes kept to themselves, and the young couple at number 10 had only moved in 2 years ago. The return address was always the same, but I could never read it clearly. The ink looked deliberately smudged, as if someone had run their thumb across it while it was still wet. I tried holding the packages up to the light in my truck, but the brown paper was too thick to see through. The weight was consistent, maybe 2 pounds, and they never rattled when I shook them gently. By May, my curiosity was getting the better of me. I started paying closer attention to the residents on Elm Street, especially on package delivery days. Mrs. Patterson would usually meet me at the mailbox with a smile and a comment about the weather. But on third Thursdays, she would stay inside until I left, then quickly retrieve her package. Through her front window, I could see her carrying it straight to her basement door. The same thing happened at every house. No one came out to greet me on package days. No one left their packages sitting on the porch like they usually did with other deliveries. Within minutes of my departure, I would see curtains twitch and front doors open just long enough for the packages to disappear inside. I started keeping a mental log. March 18th, April 15th, May 20th, June 17th. Always the third Thursday, always 12 identical packages. I began timing my route differently on those days, parking at the end of Elm Street where I could observe the houses after making my deliveries. Every single resident followed the same pattern. Quick retrieval, straight into the house, curtains drawn tight for the rest of the day. The breakthrough came in July when I was delivering a certified letter to Mrs. Patterson. She was expecting her Social Security documents and had asked me to bring them to her door instead of leaving them in the mailbox. When she answered, I could smell something strange coming from inside her house. It was not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. Sweet and herbal, like burning sage mixed with something medicinal. "Busy day today, Mrs. Patterson?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She looked nervous for the first time in 12 years. "Oh, you know how it is, Thomas. Just some spring cleaning." But it was July, and the smell was definitely not cleaning supplies. That evening, I drove back to Elm Street after my shift ended. Every house was dark except for a strange, flickering glow coming from the basement windows. Not electric light, but something softer, like candles or oil lamps. And if I strained my ears, I could hear a low humming sound, like multiple voices chanting in unison. I parked across the street and watched for over an hour. The flickering lights moved in synchronized patterns, and the humming would rise and fall in waves. At exactly 11 o'clock, everything stopped. The lights went out, the humming ceased, and normal house lights began turning on throughout the street. August came, and with it, another delivery of 12 identical packages. This time, I was ready. I had borrowed a small digital camera from my nephew and planned to document whatever was happening. But when I arrived at Elm Street that Thursday morning, something was different. Mrs. Patterson was waiting at her mailbox, but she was not alone. Mr. Rodriguez stood at his mailbox at number 8. The Hendersons were at number 12. In fact, all 12 residents of Elm Street were standing at their mailboxes, watching me approach. They did not speak as I delivered their packages. They just stood there, 12 pairs of eyes following my every movement. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps on the pavement and the rustle of paper as I placed each package in its designated mailbox. When I finished and returned to my truck, they were still standing there, still watching. I started the engine and began to drive away. But in my rearview mirror, I could see them forming a circle in the middle of the street. They were opening their packages in unison, removing identical items that I could not make out from that distance. That night, I could not sleep. Something was seriously wrong on Elm Street, and I had been unknowingly facilitating it for months. I decided to research the return address on the packages, even though it was barely legible. It took me 3 days of squinting at delivery labels before I could make out enough letters to attempt a search. The address traced back to a post office box in Salem, Massachusetts, registered to something called the Millfield Heritage Society. I had never heard of any heritage society in our town, and when I asked around, no one else had either. The postmaster in Salem was helpful, but could only tell me that the box had been rented for over 30 years, always paid in cash, always by different people. I started digging into Millfield's history, spending my evenings at the town library and searching through old records. What I found chilled me to the bone. Elm Street had been built on land that was once the site of the original Millfield settlement, founded in 1692 by refugees from the Salem witch trials. According to the records, 12 families had fled Salem and established a small community in the Vermont wilderness. They had built their homes in a circle and practiced what they called the old ways, away from the prying eyes of Puritan authorities. The settlement had prospered for decades, but in 1734, something had gone wrong. The official records were vague, mentioning only that the settlement had been abandoned due to crop failures and harsh winters. But I found a diary entry from a traveling minister who had visited the area in 1735. He wrote about finding the abandoned houses still standing, but with strange symbols carved into the wooden beams and scorch marks on the floors where fires had burned in perfect circles. The minister had also noted that the graves in the settlement cemetery contained no bodies, 12 headstones, 12 empty graves, and no explanation for what had happened to the families who had once lived there. By September, I was becoming obsessed with the mystery of Elm Street. I had convinced myself that the current residents were part of some kind of historical reenactment group or genealogical society. Maybe they were descendants of the original settlers, honoring their ancestors with monthly gatherings. It was strange, but not necessarily sinister. But then came the third Thursday in September, and everything changed. I arrived at Elm Street to find it deserted. No residents waiting at their mailboxes, no curtains twitching in windows, no signs of life at all. The packages were in my truck as usual. But when I stepped out to begin deliveries, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Every single house on Elm Street was identical now. Not just similar in architecture, but perfectly identical. The paint was the same shade of white on every house, the shutters the same shade of green, the front porches exactly the same height and width. Even the landscaping was identical, with the same flowers planted in the same patterns in every yard. I had been walking this street for 12 years, and I knew every house by heart. Mrs. Patterson's house had always had blue shutters. The Rodriguezes had replaced their front steps with brick ones just 2 years ago. The Hendersons had a distinctive oak tree in their front yard that was older than the house itself. Now, all of those individual details were gone. 12 identical houses, as if they had all been built yesterday using the same blueprint. I stood in the middle of the street, packages clutched in my trembling hands, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That was when I noticed the mailboxes. Each one had a name printed on it in identical block letters. But they were not the names of the people I had been delivering mail to for 12 years. Patterson, Rodriguez, Henderson, and all the others were gone. Instead, the mailboxes bore the names I had found in the historical records: Whitmore, Blackwood, Ashworth, and 9 others that matched the original Salem refugee families. I should have left then. I should have driven straight to the police station and reported what I had seen. Instead, I found myself walking up to the first house, the one that had belonged to Mrs. Patterson. The package felt heavier in my hands than it should have, and I could swear I felt something moving inside it. The front door opened before I could knock. A woman stood there, and for a moment, I thought it was Mrs. Patterson. But this woman was younger, maybe in her 30s, with the same facial features but darker hair and clothing that looked like it belonged in a museum. She was wearing a long black dress with a white collar, and her hair was pulled back in a style I had seen in old portraits. "You have been faithful in your service, Thomas Richardson," she said in a voice that sounded like Mrs. Patterson, but spoke with an accent I could not place. "The time has come for you to join us." Behind her, through the doorway, I could see the interior of the house. It was not Mrs. Patterson's living room with its floral wallpaper and modern furniture. Instead, I glimpsed a room lit by oil lamps, with rough wooden furniture and herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. I stumbled backward, dropping the packages on the porch. They hit the wooden boards with a sound like breaking glass, and a thick, dark liquid began seeping out of the torn brown paper. The smell that rose from the spilled contents was overwhelming, metallic and organic, like blood mixed with rich soil. "Do not be afraid," the woman who looked like Mrs. Patterson continued. "We have been waiting for you to understand, waiting for you to see. You have been chosen to carry our messages, to help us maintain the connection between worlds. The packages you have delivered contain the essence of the old settlement, the blood and bone of our ancestors, mixed with the herbs of our craft." I turned and ran. Behind me, I could hear doors opening along the entire street, and voices calling my name in unison. Not the voices of the people I had known for 12 years, but older voices, speaking in harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself. I made it to my truck and drove away as fast as I could. But in my rearview mirror, I could see 12 figures standing in the middle of Elm Street. They were not the residents I had known, but people in old-fashioned clothing, holding hands in a circle around the spilled contents of the packages I had dropped. When I reached the main road, I pulled over and called the police. But when they arrived at Elm Street 20 minutes later, they found nothing unusual. 12 normal houses with 12 normal residents who claimed they had no idea what I was talking about. The officers said I seemed stressed and suggested I take some time off from work. The next day, I requested a transfer to a different route. I could not bring myself to go back to Elm Street, not after what I had seen. My supervisor was understanding and assigned me to the industrial district on the other side of town. But that was not the end of it. 2 weeks later, I received a package at my own home. Same brown paper wrapping, same smudged return address, same weight and size as the ones I had been delivering to Elm Street. My name was written on it, in the same block letters I had seen on the mailboxes that day. I never opened it. I took it straight to the police station and demanded they investigate. But they treated me like a man having a nervous breakdown. The package sat on the evidence shelf for a month before they returned it to me, claiming there was nothing suspicious about a resident receiving mail. When I got home, I built a fire in my backyard and burned the package without opening it. The flames turned green when they touched the brown paper, and the smoke smelled like the herbs I had detected in Mrs. Patterson's house. As it burned, I could swear I heard voices whispering in the crackling flames, calling my name and promising that I would return to Elm Street eventually. That was 6 months ago. I moved to a different town, got a job at a hardware store, and tried to forget about Millfield and Elm Street. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of packages being delivered to my door. When I look outside, there is nothing there, but I can smell that herbal scent drifting through my window. And sometimes, when I am driving through small towns on my way to work, I see familiar faces in the windows of houses I pass. Faces that look like Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Rodriguez, and the Hendersons, but wearing clothes from centuries past watching me with eyes that seem to know exactly where I am and what I am trying to forget. I know they are still waiting for me on Elm Street, waiting for me to understand that some routes, once walked, can never truly be abandoned. The mail must always be delivered, and some messages are too important to remain unread. Nobody wanted to talk about what happened during the lockdown drill at Cedar Falls Elementary, least of all the other school board members. But as the newest member of the board, I thought it was my responsibility to ask the hard questions. Martha Hendricks, that is my name, and I had been elected just 6 months earlier on a platform of transparency and child safety. The parents in Cedar Falls trusted me to be their voice, to make sure their children were protected and educated properly. I wish I had never opened that door. Some secrets are buried so deep that digging them up destroys everything you thought you knew about the place you call home. Cedar Falls is one of those Montana towns that exists because it has to, not because anyone particularly wants it to. 800 people scattered across a valley that gets snowed in for 4 months of the year, surrounded by mountains that look beautiful on postcards, but feel like prison walls when you live between them. The elementary school serves the whole county, bringing in kids from ranches and tiny settlements spread across 50 square miles. It is the heart of our community, the one place where everyone comes together. I had lived in Cedar Falls my whole life, raised 3 children who graduated from that same elementary school, and spent 15 years volunteering for everything from bake sales to field trips. When longtime board member Jim Patterson announced his retirement, everyone assumed I would run for his seat. I won by a landslide, mainly because nobody else wanted the job. School board meetings in small towns are usually exercises in bureaucratic tedium, arguing about budget allocations and maintenance schedules. But my first meeting in September changed everything I thought I knew about our little school and the people who ran it. The other 4 board members had all served for years. Principal Janet Morrison had been there since before my oldest child started kindergarten. Superintendent Dr. William Chen oversaw 3 small schools across the county and treated Cedar Falls Elementary like his personal kingdom. Board Chairman Robert Fitzgerald owned the largest ranch in the area and carried himself like he owned the town, too. The only other woman on the board, Susan Walsh, taught high school in the next town over and rarely spoke during meetings. Before we begin tonight's regular business, Dr. Chen announced at that September meeting, we need to review some security footage from last month's lockdown drill. He gestured to a television that had been wheeled into the conference room. Just routine documentation for our safety protocols. I had heard about the lockdown drill, of course. It had happened on a Tuesday in late August, just before school started for the year. The teachers had been preparing their classrooms when the alarm system activated, and they had followed standard procedures for securing the building. Nothing unusual about it, or so I had been told. Dr. Chen pressed play on the remote, and grainy black and white footage filled the screen. The timestamp showed August 28th, 2:15 in the afternoon. I could see teachers moving quickly through the hallways, checking that doors were locked and windows were covered. Everything looked exactly like what you would expect from a well-executed safety drill. The teachers responded perfectly, Principal Morrison noted, making a mark on her clipboard. Average response time was under 90 seconds across all classrooms. I was taking notes, trying to be diligent in my new role, when I noticed something that made me pause. "Wait," I said, pointing at the screen. "Can you rewind that last part?" Dr. Chen looked annoyed, but complied. The footage rewound to show the main hallway outside the kindergarten classrooms. Teachers were moving efficiently from room to room, but in the corner of the frame, I could see something that did not make sense. "There," I said, leaning forward. Those 3 children in the hallway. Why are they not in a classroom during a lockdown? The other board members exchanged glances. Chairman Fitzgerald cleared his throat. Martha, these are just the details we work through in post-drill analysis. Nothing to be concerned about. But I was concerned. The 3 children on the footage appeared to be elementary age, walking calmly down the hallway while teachers were rushing to implement lockdown procedures. They were not running or hiding or showing any of the urgency that the situation should have demanded. They were just walking, almost casually, toward what looked like the rear exit of the building. Who are those children? I asked. And why are they leaving the building during a lockdown? Susan Walsh spoke up for the first time that evening. Martha, these drills can be confusing. Sometimes protocols are not followed perfectly, and we make adjustments for next time. I made a note to ask for a list of all students who had been in the building that day. Something about the footage bothered me, though I could not put my finger on exactly what. The 3 children looked familiar, but I could not place them. Cedar Falls is small enough that I know most of the families, at least by sight. I would like copies of this footage for my records, I announced. As board members, we should all have access to materials that document safety procedures. Dr. Chen's response was immediate and firm. These recordings contain sensitive security information. They remain in district custody only. That response raised more red flags. In my previous volunteer work with the school, I had never encountered resistance to reasonable requests for documentation. But Chairman Fitzgerald was already moving on to budget items, and my attempts to return to the topic were smoothly deflected. Over the next few weeks, I could not shake my unease about those 3 children. I started paying closer attention to enrollment records and attendance sheets, trying to identify who had been in the building that day. The official documentation showed that 12 teachers and 2 maintenance staff had been present for the drill, but there was no mention of any children. When I asked Principal Morrison directly about student presence during the drill, she seemed confused. Students. Martha, the drill was conducted during our professional development week. No children were in the building, but I had seen them clearly on the footage. 3 elementary-age children walking calmly through the hallway while teachers implemented lockdown procedures. Either Principal Morrison was mistaken about the date, or something else was happening that no one wanted to discuss. I decided to do my own investigation. Cedar Falls is small enough that unusual events create ripples throughout the community. And if 3 children had been in the school during what was supposed to be a staff-only day, someone would remember. I started asking casual questions during my weekly trips to the grocery store, the post office, and the diner on Main Street. The responses I received were strange and inconsistent. When I asked Linda Rodriguez at the post office if she remembered anything unusual happening at the school in late August, she got a distant look in her eyes and said, "Now that you mention it, I did see some kids walking down Maple Street that Tuesday afternoon. Thought it was odd since school had not started yet." "Do you remember what they looked like?" I pressed. Linda paused for a long moment, like she was trying to recall a dream. 3 of them, I think, walking together. But I cannot quite remember their faces. Similar conversations throughout town yielded the same pattern. People remembered seeing children that day, but no one could provide specific details about who they were or where they had gone. It was as if the entire town had a collective blind spot about 3 specific kids. My breakthrough came when I was reviewing the school's enrollment records from the past several years. I was looking for patterns, trying to identify which families might have children who would have been in the building that day for any reason. That was when I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. 3 children had been enrolled at Cedar Falls Elementary for the previous school year, but had not returned in the fall. Emma Sullivan, age 7, Michael Patterson, age 9, and Zoe Chen, age 6. According to the records, all three had moved away during the summer with their families. But when I cross-referenced their information with county records, I found no documentation of any family moves, no forwarding addresses, and no transfer requests to schools in other districts. Emma Sullivan's family had lived in the same house for 12 years. Michael Patterson's father worked at the grain elevator and had no reason to relocate. Zoe Chen was Dr. Chen's own niece, living with her grandparents after her parents died in a car accident 2 years earlier. I called the numbers on file for all three families. Emma Sullivan's phone had been disconnected. Michael Patterson's father claimed he had never heard of me and hung up when I mentioned the school board. But it was the call to Zoe Chen's grandparents that confirmed my worst fears. "Zoe?" Mrs. Chen's voice was shaky and confused. "We have not seen Zoe since..." When was it? I cannot seem to remember. She was here, and then she was not. The doctors said it was grief making us forget, but we know she existed. We have her things, her pictures. I drove to the Chen house that same afternoon. The elderly couple invited me in, and what I saw broke my heart. Zoe's bedroom was perfectly preserved, as if she had just stepped out for a few minutes. But when I looked closely at the family photographs displayed throughout the house, I noticed something disturbing. In every photo that should have included Zoe, there was a strange blur or shadow, as if someone had been carefully erased from the images. "She was right there," Mr. Chen kept saying, pointing to empty spaces in photographs. "We remember her being right there." That evening, I called an emergency meeting with Chairman Fitzgerald. I presented him with everything I had discovered: the missing children, the inconsistent records, the gaps in everyone's memory. His response was not what I expected. "Martha," he said in a tone that was patient but firm, "you are dealing with a very sensitive situation that requires careful handling. Some matters are best left to those with experience in these areas." "What kind of sensitive situation involves 3 missing children and altered records?" I demanded. Fitzgerald was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like he was making a decision. Finally, he spoke. "Meet me at the school tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. Come alone, and I will show you what really happened during that lockdown drill." I should have brought someone with me. I should have called the state police or the FBI or anyone with authority beyond our little county. Instead, I drove to Cedar Falls Elementary alone on a cold October night, my hands shaking as I unlocked the front door with the key I had been given as a board member. Chairman Fitzgerald was waiting in the main hallway with Principal Morrison and Dr. Chen. The building felt different at night, shadows stretching longer than they should and familiar spaces taking on ominous shapes. "Before we show you the complete footage," Dr. Chen said, "you need to understand the history of this building. Cedar Falls Elementary was built in 1952 on land that had previously been used for other purposes. The county purchased the property from a private organization that had operated here for many years." He led me to the library, where a projector had been set up. The screen displayed a series of photographs that looked like they had been taken decades earlier. Black and white images of the same building, but with different signage and different people. From 1928 to 1951, this was the Cedar Falls Institute for Exceptional Children, Dr. Chen continued. It was a residential facility for children with what were then called developmental disabilities, but it also served as a research center for experimental treatments. The photographs showed children in institutional clothing, standing in rows in front of the building that was now our elementary school. Their faces were blank and distant, and many appeared to be heavily medicated. The institute was closed after a state investigation revealed Irregularities in their treatment methods, Principal Morrison added. 23 children who had been residents simply vanished during the final week of operation. No records of where they went, no family claims, no documentation of transfers to other facilities. I felt sick as the implications began to sink in. You are telling me that children disappeared from this building 70 years ago, and now 3 more children have vanished? Chairman Fitzgerald activated the projector remote, and new footage filled the screen. This was not the edited version I had seen at the board meeting. This was raw security camera footage from multiple angles, showing the entire sequence of events during the August lockdown drill. The footage began normally, with teachers implementing lockdown procedures throughout the building. But at the 2-minute mark, something extraordinary happened. 3 children simply materialized in the main hallway, not walking in from another room, not emerging from hiding places. They appeared out of thin air, like smoke condensing into solid form. Emma Sullivan, Michael Patterson, and Zoe Chen stood in the hallway for several seconds, looking around with expressions of confusion and fear. Then they began walking toward the rear exit, their movements mechanical and synchronized, like they were being controlled by an external force. "The building remembers," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Every few years, usually during times of stress or change, the Institute reasserts itself. The children who vanished in 1951 are still here, still trapped in the building's memory. And sometimes, they take living children back with them." The footage continued, showing the 3 children reaching the rear exit. But instead of opening the door and leaving, they simply walked through it, passing through solid wood and metal like they were made of mist. On the exterior camera, there was no sign of them. They had not exited the building. They had been absorbed by it. "Where are they now?" I whispered, though I was not sure I wanted to know the answer. "They exist in the spaces between spaces," Principal Morrison replied. "In the walls, in the foundation, in the memory of what this place used to be. We have learned to recognize the signs when the building is becoming active. The lockdown drill was not a drill at all. It was a containment protocol." Chairman Fitzgerald turned off the projector and faced me directly. "This is why board positions rarely change hands in Cedar Falls. This is why certain decisions are made by people who understand the full scope of what we are dealing with. The school serves the community, but it also serves as a prison for something that cannot be allowed to spread. You have been covering up child disappearances for decades," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We have been protecting hundreds of other children," Dr. Chen corrected. "Every child who attends this school, every family in this county. The alternative is to close the building, to let whatever exists here escape into the broader world." They showed me more footage from previous years. 1998, when 2 children vanished during a fire drill. 2003, when 1 child disappeared during a severe thunderstorm. 2009, when the building claimed 3 more during a routine maintenance day. Always children who were already vulnerable, already isolated, already partially forgotten by their families and communities. "The building chooses carefully," Principal Morrison explained. "Children whose absence will create the least disruption, whose memories can be quietly erased from official records and community consciousness." "But their families remember," I protested, thinking of Mrs. Chen's confused grief. "Families remember something," Chairman Fitzgerald agreed. "But memories fade when they are not reinforced by external evidence. Pictures blur, records disappear, and eventually people convince themselves they were mistaken about what they lost." I left the school that night knowing that I faced an impossible choice. I could expose what I had learned and watch our community torn apart by investigations and media attention, while potentially releasing something far worse into the world. Or I could become complicit in a cover-up that had already claimed dozens of children over several decades. The decision was made for me 3 days later when I found a manila envelope on my front porch. Inside were professional photographs of my own grandchildren, taken recently at locations throughout Cedar Falls. Attached was a simple note: "Some secrets protect more than they harm. Welcome to the board." I have been keeping those secrets for 8 months now. I attend meetings where we discuss budget allocations and maintenance schedules, while carefully monitoring security footage for signs of the building's awakening. I help identify children who fit the profile of potential targets, and I participate in the quiet alterations of records and memories that follow each disappearance. Last month, we lost 2 more children during what the community believes was a routine safety inspection. Their families are already beginning to forget, their photographs already beginning to blur, their enrollment records already being quietly modified. And I sit in those board meetings, taking notes and asking the right questions, while 3 more empty desks wait in classrooms that will never acknowledge the children who once sat in them. Because in Cedar Falls, some kinds of education require sacrifices that can never be discussed in official minutes or annual reports. The building is stirring again. I can feel it in the way the hallways echo differently, in the way shadows move independently of their sources. Soon there will be another drill, another containment protocol, another careful selection of children whose absence will disturb the community the least. And I will be there, taking minutes and maintaining records. Because someone has to document the price we pay to keep the rest of our children safe from what lurks in the spaces between memory and forgetting. Every small town has that one place that stays open all night. And in Willow Creek, that was Mel's Diner. I worked the graveyard shift there for 8 months, and I thought I had seen everything the darkness could bring through those glass doors. Drunks stumbling home from the bar across the street, truckers needing coffee and conversation, insomniacs seeking refuge from their own thoughts. But there was one customer who changed everything I believed about life, death, and the thin line that separates the two. Her name was Hazel Morrison, and she had been dead for 38 years. George Patterson is my name. And I took that job at Mel's because I needed something to pay the bills while I figured out what to do with my life. 29 years old, fresh out of a relationship that had lasted too long, and tired of pretending I had my future mapped out like everyone else my age seemed to. The overnight shift at a diner in a town of 1,500 people was not glamorous, but it was honest work that left me alone with my thoughts and a steady stream of coffee. Willow Creek sits in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, surrounded by wheat fields that stretch to every horizon. The kind of place where 3 generations of the same family live within walking distance of each other, where everyone knows your business before you do, and where the biggest excitement is usually the high school football games on Friday nights. Mel's Diner had been serving the community since 1962. Occupying a converted train car on the edge of downtown, with red vinyl booths and a counter that had absorbed decades of conversations and confessions. The overnight shift was typically quiet. Between midnight and 6 in the morning, I might serve a dozen customers on a busy night. Mostly regulars who worked unconventional schedules or dealt with sleep troubles. I learned their names, their orders, and their stories. Coffee black for Jim Harrison, who drove the mail truck. Pie and ice cream for Mrs. Rodriguez, who cleaned offices downtown and always stopped by around 4. Eggs over easy for Danny Walsh, who worked maintenance at the grain elevator and got off work at 3. But Hazel Morrison was different from the first night I saw her. She came in at exactly 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in October. I noticed the precise timing because the old clock above the register had been running 7 minutes fast for months. And she entered just as it showed 3:24. She was elderly, maybe in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a blue dress that looked like it belonged in a different decade. "Coffee, please," she said, settling into the corner booth by the window. Her voice was soft but clear, with an accent that suggested she had grown up in this part of Kansas, but had lived elsewhere for a while. I brought her coffee in one of the heavy white mugs we used for regular customers. "Anything else?" "Pie is fresh today. Apple pie if you have it," she replied. "And vanilla ice cream?" I served her the pie and went back to my prep work for the morning shift. When I glanced over a few minutes later, she was sitting with her hands folded, looking out the window at the empty main street. The coffee cup was still full, and the pie remained untouched. She sat there for exactly 43 minutes, never drinking the coffee or eating the pie. At 4 o'clock sharp, she stood up, left exact change on the table, including a 20% tip, and walked out into the night. I watched through the window as she crossed the street and disappeared into the shadows between buildings. The next week, Tuesday night at 3:17, she returned. Same blue dress, same order, same behavior. Coffee and apple pie with vanilla ice cream, paid for but never consumed. She would sit in the corner booth for 43 minutes, staring out the window with an expression I could not read, then leave exactly at 4. After her 4th visit, I started paying closer attention. Hazel Morrison looked exactly the same each time. Not just similar clothing, but identical. The same dress with the same small wrinkle near the left shoulder. The same hairstyle with the same few strands that had escaped the bun. Even the same faint lipstick that had been applied with the same slight imperfection on the lower lip. "Do you know Hazel Morrison?" I asked Mel during one of our shift changes. He had owned the diner for 30 years and knew everyone in town. Mel paused while wiping down the counter. "Hazel Morrison died in 1987, George. Car accident out on Highway 36. Why do you ask?" "Someone with that name has been coming in during my shift. Elderly woman, blue dress, orders coffee and pie but never eats." Mel's expression grew serious. "What does she look like?" I described her in detail, including the specific way her hair was styled and the shade of blue in her dress. As I talked, Mel's face grew pale. "That is exactly what she looked like," he whispered. "But George, Hazel Morrison has been dead for 38 years. He disappeared into the back office and returned with a cardboard box filled with old photographs and newspaper clippings. Most were pictures from community events and local celebrations that had been held at the diner over the decades. Near the bottom of the box, he found what he was looking for. The newspaper clipping was from October 1987. The headline read, "Local woman dies in late-night accident." Below it was a photograph of Hazel Morrison, age 73, wearing the same blue dress I had seen her in every Tuesday night. The article explained that she had been driving home from a church meeting when her car skidded on wet leaves and struck a tree. She had died instantly at 3:17 in the morning. "She used to come in here every Tuesday night," Mel explained, his voice shaky. "Same time, same order. Coffee and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. But she was trying to lose weight, so she would order it, then just sit with it, using the smell and the company to satisfy her craving without actually eating." According to the article, Hazel had been on her way home from the diner when the accident occurred. She had left at exactly 4 o'clock, just like she had been doing during my shifts. The accident happened less than a mile from Mel's, at the intersection of Main Street and Highway 36. Why is she still coming here? I asked. Mel shook his head. I do not know. But if it is really her, there must be a reason she cannot move on. The next Tuesday, I was ready. When Hazel Morrison entered at 317, I watched her every movement more carefully than before. She walked with purpose, but also with a strange lightness, as if her feet barely touched the floor. When she sat down, the vinyl booth did not creak the way it did for other customers. When I brought her coffee, the mug felt strangely cold despite having just come from the pot that was kept at 180 degrees. Mrs. Morrison, I said, sitting across from her in the booth. Can I ask you something? She looked at me with eyes that were kind but distant, like she was seeing me from a great distance. Of course, dear. Why do you keep coming back here? For the first time in all her visits, her expression changed. Confusion flickered across her face, followed by what looked like fear. I am not sure, she admitted. I remember being here, enjoying the coffee and the pie. But I also remember being very tired, wanting to go home. I got in my car, and then... She paused, touching her forehead like she was trying to recall a difficult memory. I cannot remember what happened next. Mrs. Morrison, I said gently, you died 38 years ago. You were in a car accident after leaving this diner. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see recognition dawning in her eyes. The tree, she whispered. I remember the tree, and the rain, and the pain. Her hand moved to her chest. But if I died, why am I still here? That question haunted me for the rest of the night. After she left at 4 o'clock, I drove out to the intersection where her accident had occurred. The tree was still there, a massive oak that had been scarred by the impact, but had survived. Plastic flowers and a small cross marked the spot where Hazel Morrison had died. I started researching her life, trying to understand what might be keeping her spirit anchored to that Tuesday night routine. Through old phone books and county records, I learned that she had lived alone in a small house on Elm Street. Never married, no children, but deeply involved in her church and various community organizations. By all accounts, she had been a kind and generous person who was beloved by everyone who knew her. But there was something else I discovered that changed everything. In the weeks before her death, Hazel Morrison had been investigating irregularities in the church's finances. As the treasurer, she had noticed money disappearing from various accounts and had been quietly gathering evidence of embezzlement by other church officials. The night she died, she had not been coming from a regular church meeting. She had been meeting secretly with a lawyer from the county seat, providing him with documents that would have exposed a scheme that had stolen thousands of dollars from church members and local charities. Those documents were never found after her accident. The embezzlement continued for several more years until the scheme collapsed on its own. But by then, the evidence was gone, and no one was ever prosecuted. I realized that Hazel Morrison was trapped in the last night of her life because she had died with unfinished business. She had been carrying the weight of truth that needed to be revealed, and her death had prevented justice from being served. The next Tuesday, when she arrived at 317, I was waiting with a folder full of everything I had learned about her investigation and the embezzlement scheme. Mrs. Morrison, I said, placing the folder on the table. I think I know why you are still here. I explained what I had discovered about her final mission and how her death had allowed criminals to escape justice. As I talked, her expression grew clearer and more focused, as if she was remembering not just who she was, but why her work had been so important. They stole from the church, she said, her voice growing stronger. From the food bank, from the scholarship fund, from families who trusted us with their donations. The statute of limitations has passed, I told her. But there are still people in town who were harmed by what happened. If you can remember where you hid the evidence, maybe we can find a way to make things right. Hazel smiled for the first time since I had been serving her. The safe deposit box, she whispered. Bank of Willow Creek, box number 207. She reached into her purse, a movement that looked more real and solid than any other gesture I had seen her make. She pulled out a small brass key and placed it on the table. Give this to Pastor Williams at the Methodist Church, she said. He was not involved in the scheme. He can make sure the truth comes out, even now. As soon as she released the key, I could see her beginning to fade. Not disappearing, but becoming lighter, more transparent, like morning fog touched by sunlight. Thank you, she whispered. And for the first time since I had been serving her, she picked up the coffee cup and took a sip. That is perfect coffee, dear. Just the way I remember. She faded away completely at 4 o'clock, leaving behind only the key, exact change for her order, and the lingering scent of apple pie and vanilla ice cream. I delivered the key to Pastor Williams the next morning, along with everything I'd learned about Hazel Morrison's investigation. The safe deposit box contained decades of financial documents that exposed not just the original embezzlement, but ongoing fraud that had continued long after her death. While criminal charges were no longer possible, the revelations led to civil lawsuits that recovered hundreds of thousands of dollars for victims and their families. Scholarships were established in Hazel Morrison's name, and a memorial garden was planted at the church she had died trying to protect. I never saw her again after that Tuesday night. But sometimes, when I am working the overnight shift and the clock shows 3:17, I catch the faint scent of apple pie and vanilla ice cream drifting through the diner. And I know that somewhere, Hazel Morrison is finally at peace in Liette. They called me to settle a property dispute between two families who had been neighbors for 40 years, and I thought it would be a straightforward surveying job. Richard Blackwood is my name, and I've been measuring and mapping land boundaries across North Carolina for 15 years. Most property disputes involve a few feet here and there, maybe a fence that was built in the wrong place or a driveway that crosses into someone else's deed. But what I discovered in the hills outside Harmony Ridge changed everything I thought I knew about the secrets that can be buried beneath seemingly ordinary land. Harmony Ridge is one of those mountain communities that feels removed from the modern world, where families trace their roots back 6 or 7 generations, and newcomers are still considered outsiders after 20 years. The town proper has maybe 200 people, but the surrounding hills are dotted with isolated homesteads and family compounds that have been passed down through generations. It is the kind of place where people handle their own problems and view outside interference with deep suspicion. The Morrison and Fleming families had been feuding over a strip of land that separated their properties for as long as anyone could remember. According to the county clerk who hired me, the dispute had been going on since the early 1980s, with both families claiming ownership of a wedge-shaped piece of forest that covered about 3 acres. Previous surveys had been inconclusive, and the families had been taking turns filing lawsuits that went nowhere. We need a definitive boundary established, the clerk explained when she called me. The families are threatening violence over this thing, and we cannot have that in our county. I drove up to Harmony Ridge on a crisp October morning, my equipment loaded in the back of my truck and a folder full of deeds and historical maps on the passenger seat. The disputed land sat between 2 similar properties, both featuring older farmhouses with extensive outbuildings and cleared fields that had been carved from the surrounding forest decades ago. Dale Morrison met me at his front gate, a weathered man in his 60s with the kind of deep suspicion of outsiders that I had encountered in other mountain communities. "You the surveyor?" he asked without preamble. "Richard Blackwood," I introduced myself, extending my hand. "I understand you and your neighbors need some boundaries clarified." Morrison shook my hand grudgingly. "Been our land for 40 years, he said. "My daddy cleared that timber himself, and them Flemings got no right to it." The Fleming property was accessible by a dirt road that wound through thick forest before opening into their main compound. Jacob Fleming was younger than Morrison, maybe in his 50s, but he had the same hardened look of someone who had spent his life working the land. "Appreciate you coming out," Fleming said when I introduced myself. "That strip of land has been in our family since my grandfather's time. Morrisons are trying to steal what belongs to us." Both men insisted on being present when I conducted my survey, which made for a tense atmosphere as I set up my equipment. The disputed land was heavily forested, with thick undergrowth that made it difficult to move around with my instruments. But as I worked, I began to notice things that seemed unusual for a natural forest. The trees were all roughly the same age, suggesting the entire area had been cleared and replanted at some point. But more oddly, they seemed to be arranged in subtle patterns, with large gaps that formed rough geometric shapes when viewed from above. My electronic distance measuring device also detected irregularities in the ground that suggested extensive digging had been done at some point. "Has this land been used for farming?" I asked Morrison as I adjusted my theodolite. "Not since I've been here," he replied. "Been woods long as I can remember." Fleming gave a similar response, but both men seemed nervous whenever I asked about the history of the land. They kept glancing at each other across the disputed boundary, and I got the impression they were communicating something that I was not meant to understand. On my second day of surveying, my ground-penetrating radar began picking up anomalies throughout the disputed area. The equipment was designed to detect underground utilities and foundation remains, but what I was seeing looked more extensive and more irregular than anything related to construction or agriculture. "There are significant underground disturbances throughout this area," I told both families when they met me at the site that afternoon. "Before I can establish definitive boundaries, I need to understand what I am dealing with down there." Morrison and Fleming exchanged a look that I could not interpret. "What kind of disturbances?" Fleming asked. "Large excavations that have been backfilled," I explained. "Multiple sites, some quite deep. If there are septic systems or old foundations down there, they could affect property values and development rights." That evening at my motel in town, I spent hours studying the radar images on my laptop. What I was seeing was unlike anything in my 15 years of surveying. The underground disturbances were extensive and appeared to follow patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than random digging. More disturbing were the shapes themselves. Long, narrow excavations arranged in rough grids, each approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. As a professional surveyor, I had seen enough cemetery layouts to recognize what I was looking at. I was looking at graves, dozens of them, scattered throughout the 3-acre disputed area. The next morning, I called the county sheriff's office and requested that a deputy meet me at the site. If there were unmarked graves on the property, it became a legal matter that went far beyond a simple boundary dispute. Deputy Williams arrived within an hour, and I showed him the radar images. His reaction confirmed my suspicions. "Those look like burial sites," he agreed. "But there is no cemetery recorded in this area. Are you sure your equipment is working correctly?" I ran the scans again, and the results were consistent. 43 separate anomalies, all the right size and shape to be individual graves, scattered throughout the disputed land in a pattern that suggested they had been dug over an extended period of time. "We need to notify the families," Deputy Williams said, "and probably the State Archaeological Office. If these are Native American graves or historical burials, there are procedures we have to follow." But when we approached Morrison and Fleming with our findings, their reactions were not what I expected. Instead of surprise or concern, both men went pale and began speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "You cannot bring outsiders here," Morrison said. "This is family business." Fleming nodded in agreement. "Some things are better left buried." Deputy Williams pressed them for more information, but both families became increasingly evasive. They claimed they had no knowledge of any graves on the property and insisted that my equipment must be malfunctioning. That night, I received a phone call at my motel. The voice was male but disguised, speaking in a whisper that made it impossible to identify. "Stop digging," the voice said. "Leave Harmony Ridge tomorrow and never come back. This is your only warning." I hung up and immediately called Deputy Williams. He promised to increase patrols around my motel and the surveying site, but I could tell he was taking the threat seriously. The next day, I returned to the disputed land with a different approach. Instead of focusing on boundary lines, I concentrated on documenting the underground anomalies. If these were illegal burial sites, I needed evidence that would hold up in court. As I worked, I noticed that both families were watching me from a distance. Morrison stood at the edge of his property with what looked like a rifle, while Fleming paced back and forth along his fence line. The tension was palpable, and I began to understand that I had stumbled into something far more serious than a property dispute. My breakthrough came when I decided to dig a small test hole at one of the radar anomaly sites. I had brought a folding shovel for exactly this purpose, and I chose a location that was roughly in the center of the disputed area. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something that was definitely not soil or rock. I cleared away more dirt and exposed what was unmistakably human bone. A skull, partially preserved and stained dark brown from decades in the earth. But this was not an old burial. There were metal fragments mixed with the remains, pieces of what looked like contemporary clothing and personal effects. I could see a wristwatch, tarnished jewelry, and scraps of fabric that had not fully decomposed. I was looking at a murder victim, not an ancestor. I immediately called Deputy Williams and began photographing everything before disturbing the site further. But as I worked, I became aware that I was no longer alone in the forest. Morrison and Fleming had approached silently, and they were now standing about 20 feet away, watching me document their secret. Both men were armed, and their expressions made it clear that they viewed me as a threat to something much more important than property boundaries. "You should not have dug there," Morrison said quietly. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, still crouched beside the exposed grave. Fleming answered, 40 years, give or take, maybe a few more. People pass through these mountains, drifters and travelers who nobody misses. Sometimes they cause problems, threaten families, steal from decent folks. So you kill them," I said. "So we protect what is ours," Morrison corrected. "And we dispose of problems in a way that keeps our community safe." I realized that the property dispute had been a cover story for decades. The two families were not fighting over the land. They were cooperating to maintain it as a private burial ground for victims they could not afford to have discovered. "The surveying stops now," Fleming said, raising his rifle. "And you forget what you found here." Deputy Williams arrived 15 minutes later to find my equipment abandoned, but no sign of me. The test hole had been hastily filled, and both families claimed they had no idea where I had gone. It took search teams 3 days to find my body in a ravine 2 miles from the disputed property. The official cause of death was listed as an accidental fall while surveying remote terrain, despite the obvious evidence of violence. But I am still here in a way, still measuring and mapping the secrets buried in the hills around Harmony Ridge. And I know that someday, someone else will discover what the Morrison and Fleming families have been hiding in the land they never really fought over. The 44 graves are still there, waiting to tell their stories to anyone brave enough to dig deep enough to find the truth. I was supposed to fill in for the regular nurse in Riverside for just 2 weeks while she recovered from surgery. But what I discovered in that small Iowa town kept me awake for months after I finally escaped. Betty Sullivan is my name, and I have been a visiting nurse for 12 years, covering rural communities across the Midwest where medical professionals are scarce and help is always needed. I thought I had seen every kind of medical situation possible in isolated places. But Riverside taught me that some communities will go to unimaginable lengths to preserve what they consider their way of life. Riverside sits along a bend in the Cedar River, population 637, according to the faded welcome sign at the edge of town. The kind of place where cornfields stretch in every direction, where the biggest building is the grain elevator, and where 3 generations of families live within a few blocks of each other. It should have been a routine assignment. Cover the basic medical needs of a small community for 2 weeks, help with medication management for elderly residents, and assist the local doctor with whatever cases came up. Dr. Arthur Coleman had been Riverside's only physician for over 30 years, and everyone spoke of him with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints. He had delivered most of the younger generation, treated everything from farming accidents to heart attacks, and never turned away a patient, regardless of their ability to pay. When I arrived at his clinic on a Monday morning in September, he greeted me with the warm professionalism I had come to expect from small-town doctors. "Welcome to Riverside, Betty," he said, shaking my hand with a grip that was firm despite his 70-plus years. "Martha Wilson will be back in 2 weeks, but until then, I am grateful for the help." The clinic was small but well-equipped, occupying a converted house on Main Street with examination rooms that had been added over the years as the practice grew. Dr. Coleman showed me around, introduced me to the receptionist and the part-time lab technician, and explained the filing system for patient records. "Most of our patients are families who have been coming here for decades," he explained as we walked through the facility. "You will find that Riverside folks are remarkably healthy for a rural community. We have very low rates of cancer, heart disease, and other chronic conditions that plague similar towns." That first week seemed to confirm his assessment. I saw patients for routine blood pressure checks, diabetes monitoring, and minor injuries. Everyone was friendly and seemed genuinely healthy for their age groups. But I began to notice patterns in the medical records that struck me as unusual. Every family in town seemed to share certain genetic traits that should have been much more rare. Unusual eye colors, distinctive facial structures, and physical characteristics that appeared with remarkable frequency across supposedly unrelated family lines. More concerning were the laboratory results I reviewed while organizing patient files. Blood work from residents showed genetic markers that I had never seen clustered together in such high concentrations. Not necessarily abnormal results, but unusual patterns that suggested these people shared far more genetic material than would be typical for a general population, even in an isolated rural community. "Dr. Coleman," I asked during one of our consultations, "have there been genetic studies done on the population here? Some of these lab results show interesting patterns." His reaction was immediate and defensive. "Betty, I think you are reading too much into routine blood work. Small communities naturally develop certain shared characteristics over generations. But my nursing background included genetics training, and what I was seeing went far beyond normal population genetics. These people were not just distantly related through common ancestors. They were showing markers consistent with much closer genetic relationships than anyone was acknowledging. My suspicions deepened when I began reviewing the obstetric records from the past several decades. Dr. Coleman had delivered hundreds of babies over his career, but the birth records showed patterns that made no medical sense. Pregnancy complications that should have occurred regularly in any population were completely absent. Genetic disorders that should have appeared at predictable rates simply did not exist in Riverside. Either this community had the most extraordinary genetic luck in medical history, or something else was happening that was not reflected in the official records. "I need to ask you about the fertility treatments," I said to Dr. Coleman at the end of my first week. He paused in his chart review. "What fertility treatments?" "The medication inventory shows regular orders for reproductive hormones and genetic screening supplies that would typically be used for fertility interventions. But I do not see any corresponding patient records for these treatments." Dr. Coleman closed the chart he had been reviewing and looked at me with an expression that had shifted from friendly to calculating. "Betty, you are a temporary employee here. Your job is to assist with routine patient care, not to audit medical practices." That evening, I drove through Riverside's residential neighborhoods, paying closer attention to the families I had been treating. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions. Children who supposedly belonged to different families showed striking physical similarities. Siblings who should have been years apart in age looked like twins, and adults who claimed no family relationship could have been identical relatives. The next morning, I arrived at the clinic early and used my access to the medical records to conduct a more thorough review. What I discovered made me physically ill. Dr. Coleman had not been practicing conventional medicine for decades. He had been conducting genetic experiments on the entire population of Riverside, using fertility treatments and selective breeding to create what amounted to a controlled human breeding program. The medical files contained detailed genetic analyses of every resident, tracking bloodlines and genetic markers with the precision of a livestock breeding operation. Families that claimed to be unrelated were actually carefully selected genetic matches. Pregnancies were not natural occurrences, but planned genetic combinations designed to reinforce desired traits. More horrifying were the records of unsuccessful outcomes. Children who did not meet genetic criteria were listed as stillbirths or infant deaths, but follow-up documentation suggested they had been removed from families and relocated elsewhere. The numbers were staggering. Over 30 years, hundreds of children had been born in Riverside, but only those who met Dr. Coleman's genetic standards had been allowed to remain. "You should not have access to those files," Dr. Coleman said from behind me. I turned to find him standing in the doorway of the records room. And for the first time since I had arrived in Riverside, he did not look like a kindly small-town doctor. He looked like a man who had been caught in the middle of something unforgivable. "What have you done to these people?" I whispered. "I have created perfection," he replied calmly. "Riverside represents the future of human evolution. 3 generations of carefully controlled genetic selection, eliminating hereditary diseases and enhancing desirable traits. These people are healthier, more intelligent, and more physically capable than any normal population." "They are your experiments," I said. "You have been treating an entire town like laboratory animals." Dr. Coleman smiled. "And now you understand why you are really here, Betty. Martha Wilson did not have surgery. She began asking the same questions you are asking, and she had to be removed from the situation. I realized with growing horror that my assignment to Riverside had not been random. I had been selected, evaluated, and brought here for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with providing medical care. "You need new genetic material," I said. "The breeding program is starting to show signs of inbreeding, and you need outside DNA to continue. You have excellent genetics, Betty. Healthy family history, high intelligence, and no chronic medical conditions. You would make valuable contributions to our community." I backed toward the clinic's rear exit, but Dr. Coleman moved to block my path. "The people of Riverside have been very patient with your investigation, but now it is time for you to accept your role here." Through the window, I could see residents gathering in the street outside the clinic. Men, women, and children who I had been treating for the past week, all watching the building with expressions that were no longer friendly and welcoming. They knew what was happening inside, and they were there to ensure I did not leave. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, stalling while I looked for another exit. "Since I arrived here in 1993, Dr. Coleman replied. "Riverside was dying then, losing population and economic opportunities. I offered them a chance to become something special, something better than human. They embraced the vision." "You mean they embraced the delusion?" I corrected. "These people are not evolved. They are victims of medical abuse on a scale that should be impossible in modern America." Dr. Coleman's expression hardened. "They are the future, Betty. And you are going to help ensure that future continues." I broke the window behind me with a paperweight from the desk, climbed through, cutting my arms on the glass, but escaping into the alley behind the clinic. I could hear shouting from inside the building and the sound of people running toward my location. I made it to my car and drove out of Riverside faster than I had ever driven in my life, not stopping until I reached the state police barracks 50 miles away. But when the investigators arrived in Riverside the next day, they found a normal small town with a respected doctor who claimed he had never heard of Betty Sullivan. The medical records I had seen were gone. The genetic testing equipment had vanished. Even the blood samples that had shown unusual markers had been replaced with normal results. Dr. Coleman presented documentation showing that no visiting nurse had been assigned to his clinic, and the residents of Riverside supported his statements completely. The investigation was closed within a week due to lack of evidence. But I know what I saw in those files. I know what Dr. Coleman was doing to the people of Riverside, and I know that somewhere in Iowa, a genetic experiment is continuing under the guise of small-town medical care. The perfect community that never gets sick, never shows genetic disorders, and never questions why their doctor has been controlling their lives for over 30 years. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder about other small towns with beloved doctors and unusually healthy populations. I wonder how many rural communities have embraced similar visions of genetic perfection, and how many visitors like me have disappeared into experiments that continue in the shadows of American medicine. I came to Copper Hill to film their annual Harvest Festival, thinking it would be a charming, small-town tradition documentary that could help launch my independent filmmaking career. Arthur Phillips is my name, and I had spent 2 years researching unique American festivals when I discovered references to Copper Hill's 3-day celebration in obscure folklore journals. The descriptions made it sound like a perfect subject. An isolated Texas community that had maintained pre-industrial harvest traditions for over a century. I had no idea I was documenting the final phase of a ritual that had been consuming visitors for generations. Copper Hill sits in the East Texas piney woods, population 412, accessible only by a single winding road that branches off from a state highway and disappears into dense forest. The kind of place that exists on maps but feels forgotten by the modern world, where the cell phone service is spotty and the nearest interstate is 2 hours away. Perfect for a documentary about authentic American traditions that have survived in isolation. I arrived on a Thursday in late October, 2 days before the Harvest Festival was scheduled to begin. The town seemed frozen in time, with wooden storefronts that could have been built 50 years ago, and residents who moved with the unhurried pace of people who have never been in a rush to get anywhere. Everyone I met was friendly but guarded, willing to talk about the weather and local history, but evasive when I asked specific questions about the festival. "You will understand everything once it begins," Mayor Patricia Hendricks told me when I interviewed her at the town hall. Copper Hill's Harvest Festival is not like other celebrations. It is something that has to be experienced to be appreciated. I set up my equipment at the Copper Hill Inn, a converted Victorian house that served as the town's only lodging. The proprietor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Coleman, seemed nervous about having a filmmaker in town during festival weekend. "Most visitors who come for the festival do not need accommodations," she explained while showing me to my room. "They usually become part of the community by the end of the 3 days." I assumed she meant that people enjoyed the festival so much they extended their stays or decided to move to Copper Hill. Small towns are always hoping to attract new residents, and a successful festival could be good for local economic development. The first day of the Harvest Festival began at dawn on Saturday, with what the residents called the Awakening Ceremony. The entire town gathered in the central square, forming concentric circles around a raised platform where Mayor Hendricks and several other community leaders stood wearing elaborate costumes that looked handmade and ancient. I filmed everything, focusing on the intricate details of the costumes and the solemn expressions of the participants. The ceremony involved chanting in what sounded like a mixture of languages, some recognizable as variants of English and Spanish, but others completely unfamiliar. The townspeople moved in synchronized patterns, stepping in rhythm to drums that were played by children who could not have been more than 10 years old. "This represents the awakening of the harvest spirit," explained James Morrison, a local teacher who had volunteered to be my guide. "Our ancestors brought these traditions from the old country, and we have maintained them without interruption for over 100 years. But as I filmed, I began to notice details that did not match Morrison's explanation. The costumes were not folk designs from any European tradition I could identify. The symbols carved into the wooden platform were not Celtic or Germanic, but something much older and more primitive. And the chanting, when I listened carefully through my headphones, contained words that sounded more like incantations than traditional folk songs. The second day involved what the residents called the binding ceremony. This time, the townspeople constructed elaborate displays throughout the business district, using corn stalks, pumpkins, and other harvest decorations to create intricate patterns that were visible from the second-story windows of the inn. From my elevated vantage point with my camera, I could see that the decorations were not random arrangements. They formed a complex geometric design that encompassed the entire downtown area, with the town square at the center and radiating patterns that extended to the edges of the commercial district. Each family contributes specific elements to the overall design, Morrison explained as we walked through the decorated streets. The pattern has been refined over generations, with each year adding new components while maintaining the essential structure. But the pattern I was documenting looked less like harvest decorations and more like some kind of containment circle, with symbols and arrangements that seemed designed to trap or control something rather than celebrate it. The geometric precision was far too exact for folk art, suggesting knowledge of mathematical principles that seemed out of place in a rural Texas community. On the second evening, I was invited to join the townspeople for what they called the Feast of Preparation. Long tables had been set up in the town square, loaded with food that had been prepared by various families throughout the day. Everyone in Copper Hill was present, from newborn babies to elderly residents who could barely walk. The food was unlike anything I had ever tasted. Rich, complex flavors that seemed familiar but impossible to identify. When I asked about the recipes, people would smile and give vague answers about family traditions and secret ingredients that had been passed down for generations. "You are eating the essence of Copper Hill," Mayor Hendricks told me as she refilled my plate. "Food that connects you to our community and our history." As the evening progressed, I began to feel strange. Not sick exactly, but altered in a way I could not describe. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds were more intense, and I felt a growing sense of connection to the people around me. Other visitors to the festival were experiencing similar effects, laughing and talking with residents as if they had known each other for years. The food helps newcomers understand what Copper Hill is really about, Morrison explained when I asked about the unusual sensations. It opens the mind to possibilities that might otherwise be rejected. That night, I reviewed the footage I had shot during the first 2 days of the festival. What I saw disturbed me more than I could rationally explain. When I watched the ceremonies through my camera, the participants looked different than they had appeared to my naked eye. Their movements were more mechanical, their expressions were blank and distant, and their costumes seemed to be made of materials that shifted and changed texture as I watched. More disturbing were the visitors like myself. In the footage, we appeared to be in various states of transformation, our faces becoming more similar to the residents and our movements becoming more synchronized with the group activities. I looked at my own reflection in the inn's mirror and saw subtle changes in my features that had not been there when I arrived. The third day was called the Harvest of Souls, and I woke up knowing that I needed to leave Copper Hill immediately. Whatever was happening during the festival was not a cultural tradition, but something far more sinister and supernatural. But when I tried to pack my equipment and check out of the inn, Mrs. Coleman informed me that leaving was not possible until the festival concluded. "The roads are closed during the final ceremony," she explained with a smile that no longer looked friendly. "Everyone who participates in the Harvest Festival must see it through to completion." I discovered that my car keys were missing from my room, and my cell phone had stopped working entirely. The other visitors who had arrived for the festival seemed unconcerned about these developments, apparently accepting that they would remain in Copper Hill for as long as necessary. The final ceremony began at sunset in the town square, with all the residents and visitors forming a massive circle around the decorated platform. Mayor Hendricks began chanting in the unknown language I had heard during the previous ceremonies, and the entire crowd responded in unison with words I somehow knew, despite never having heard them before. As the chanting continued, I began to understand what was really happening in Copper Hill. The Harvest Festival was not celebrating the agricultural harvest, but harvesting something else entirely: the identities, memories, and souls of visitors who were drawn to the community. The geometric patterns created with harvest decorations were not folk art, but a massive ritual circle designed to trap and transform anyone who participated in the 3-day ceremony. The food served during the Feast of Preparation contained substances that made visitors susceptible to the transformation process. And the final ceremony was designed to complete the harvest by absorbing newcomers into the collective consciousness of Copper Hill. I could feel my individual identity dissolving as the chanting reached a crescendo. My memories of life outside Copper Hill were fading, replaced by a sense of belonging to something ancient and hungry. The other visitors around me were undergoing the same transformation, their faces taking on the blank expressions I had seen in my camera footage. But some part of me, the part that had spent years behind a camera lens documenting reality, remained separate from the collective experience. while my body participated in the ritual, my consciousness retreated to a space where I could observe what was happening without being completely consumed by it. I watched as the festival concluded with all the visitors fully transformed into residents of Copper Hill, ready to help prepare for next year's celebration and the new harvest of souls it would bring. I saw myself smiling and shaking hands with Mayor Hendricks, accepting my permanent role in the community, while some deeper part of my mind screamed in helpless horror. The documentary I had intended to create was never completed, but the footage still exists somewhere in the collective memory of Copper Hill. Every year, during the Harvest Festival, that part of me that remains separate watches new filmmakers and researchers and curious visitors arrive in town, drawn by the same obscure references that had brought me here. And every year, I participate in their transformation while desperately hoping that one of them will prove strong enough to escape with the truth about what really happens when small towns maintain traditions that are older and hungrier than anyone wants to believe. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we are bringing you 7 of the most disturbing true cornfield horror stories ever documented. Tales that will forever change how you view those endless golden rows that stretch across America's heartland. These are not works of fiction, but genuine accounts from real people who experienced terror in places most of us consider peaceful and pastoral. Each story has been meticulously verified through witness statements, police reports, and corroborating evidence that confirms these nightmares actually happened. Cornfields are not just crops waiting for harvest. They are isolated labyrinths where anything can hide, where screams go unheard, and where the line between civilization and something far darker becomes dangerously thin. If you crave authentic horror content that does not rely on jump scares, but instead on the chilling reality of what human beings have actually survived, subscribe to Buried Files and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into true terror. After you hear these 7 accounts, we want you to share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us if you have ever felt that primal fear when standing at the edge of a cornfield at dusk. Now prepare yourself as we venture into the stalks where nightmares grow alongside the harvest. I was 17 when I found out someone had been living in my grandmother's cornfield, watching our family for months. What started as a peaceful summer job turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. And it taught me that the greatest horrors are not supernatural. They are human. My name is Oscar, and 3 years ago I agreed to spend the summer at my grandmother's farm in rural Iowa to help with the seasonal work. She owned 200 acres of prime farmland, with the main house sitting on a small hill surrounded by what seemed like endless rows of corn. The property had been in our family for 4 generations, and my grandmother, despite being in her 70s, still insisted on managing most of the operations herself. She needed help that summer because my uncle, who usually assisted her, had taken a job out of state. I was between high school and college, had no solid plans, and honestly thought it would be a peaceful few months of simple labor and good home cooking. I was naive. The first 2 weeks were exactly what I expected. I woke up at dawn, helped with equipment maintenance, drove the tractor through the fields checking irrigation lines, and spent my evenings on the porch with my grandmother, listening to her stories about the old days. The cornfield was beautiful in an overwhelming way. When you stood at the edge and looked out, all you could see were endless green stalks swaying in the breeze, stretching to the horizon in perfect rows. The corn was already chest high by early June, and my grandmother said it would reach well over 7 feet by harvest time in September. I found the repetitive nature of the work calming, and the isolation of the farm felt like a vacation from the chaos of suburban life I was used to back home. Everything changed on a Wednesday evening in my 3rd week there. I was walking back from checking the irrigation system on the south 40 acres, following the maintenance road that cut through the middle of the field. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows between the rows, and I was thinking about the dinner my grandmother was probably already preparing. That is when I noticed something odd. There were boot prints in the soft mud near one of the irrigation valves, clear as day. And they were not mine. They were not my grandmother's either. Hers were small, and these were at least a size 11 or 12, deep impressions from someone heavy. I wore a size 9, and my prints looked completely different. I stood there staring at those prints for a solid minute, trying to rationalize them. Maybe a utility worker had come by to check something. Maybe one of the neighbors had cut through our property. But something felt wrong. The prints were fresh, probably from that same day, and they led away from the road, deeper into the corn rows where there was no reason for anyone to go. I followed them for maybe 20 feet before they disappeared into the dense stalks. And I decided I did not want to go any farther as the light was fading. I told myself I would mention it to my grandmother at dinner. When I brought it up that evening, she frowned and said she had not authorized any workers to come by, and none of the neighbors would cut through the field without asking first. She seemed concerned, but not alarmed, and she suggested it might have been someone lost or confused who wandered onto the property. It happened occasionally, she said, especially during summer when tourists got turned around on the rural roads. She told me not to worry about it, but I could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Unease, maybe? That night I had trouble sleeping. My bedroom window faced the cornfield, and I kept imagining I saw movement between the rows, though I knew it was probably just the wind. The next day I was more alert, more watchful. I found myself scanning the field constantly as I worked, looking for anything out of place. And I found things. Small things that could have been coincidence, but started to form a pattern. A section of corn near the old equipment barn was disturbed. Stalks bent at odd angles, as if something had pushed through them instead of walking between the rows. An empty tin can near the fence line, rusted but not ancient, sitting in the grass where it had no business being. Most disturbing was the feeling I got around sunset. Every evening when I was finishing up the day's work, I felt like I was being watched. It was a primal sensation, the kind that makes the hair on your neck stand up and your peripheral vision go into overdrive. I did not say anything to my grandmother about these observations because I did not want to worry her, and part of me thought I was being paranoid. But on Saturday of that week, I decided to investigate on my own. I told my grandmother I was going to walk the fence line to check for damage, which was a normal maintenance task. But really, I planned to go deeper into the field and see if I could find any explanation for the strange signs I had been noticing. I brought a heavy flashlight, my phone fully charged, and a pocket knife that I told myself was just a tool, but knew was really for protection. I entered the field from the east side around 4 in the afternoon, giving myself plenty of daylight. The corn was dense, and once you were more than a few rows in, the world became nothing but green walls and rustling leaves. I walked carefully, following the irrigation ditches that ran through the property, looking for anything unusual. For the first 30 minutes, I found nothing. Then, about a quarter mile from the house, deep in a section we had not irrigated yet that week, I found it. Someone had created a living space in the corn. There was a flattened area about 8 feet by 10 feet where the stalks had been carefully bent down to create a floor. A dirty sleeping bag was rolled up against one side. Empty food containers were stacked neatly in a pile, the kind of non-perishable items you could buy at any gas station. protein bar wrappers, beef jerky packages, crushed water bottles. There was a small camping stove, the portable kind that runs on propane canisters. And most chilling of all, there was a pair of binoculars hanging from one of the corn stalks. The lenses pointed in the direction of my grandmother's house. My hand started shaking. This was not some confused tourist. This was not some neighbor cutting through. Someone had been living here, in our field, probably for weeks based on the amount of trash. Someone had been watching us, watching my grandmother, watching me. I pulled out my phone to call the police, but I had no signal that deep in the field. I took several photos of the campsite, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. And then I got out of there as fast as I could without running. Running would make noise. Running would let whoever this was know that I had found their hiding spot. I made it back to the house and immediately told my grandmother everything. She went pale but stayed calm, the way people from her generation do in a crisis. She called the police, and 2 deputies arrived within 20 minutes. I led them back to the spot, my grandmother insisting on coming along despite the deputies suggesting she stay at the house. When we got there, the sleeping bag was gone. The stove was gone. The binoculars were gone. Only the trash remained, and even some of that had been removed. Whoever it was had been there recently, maybe watching me find their camp, and had cleared out the moment we left. The deputies took the remaining trash as evidence and searched the immediate area, but found nothing else. They told us they would increase patrols on our road and advised us to keep all doors and windows locked at night. They said it was probably just a transient passing through, that it happened sometimes in rural areas, and that the person was most likely long gone now that they knew they had been discovered. My grandmother nodded and thanked them, but I could see she did not believe it any more than I did. That night, we both slept with our bedroom doors locked, and I kept the heaviest wrench from the tool shed next to my bed. For 3 days, nothing happened. No signs, no disturbances, no feeling of being watched. I started to think maybe the deputies were right. Maybe whoever it was had moved on. Then on Tuesday evening, as I was finishing up work around 7:30, I found a note stuck to the windshield of the tractor with a piece of tape. It was written on a torn piece of cardboard in black marker, all capital letters. Stop looking. The dread that hit me was like ice water in my veins. This person was still here, still watching, still on the property somewhere in those 200 acres of corn that provided infinite hiding places. I drove the tractor back to the barn faster than I should have, grabbed the note carefully by the edges, and brought it into the house. My grandmother called the police again. Different deputies came this time, took the note, asked questions, searched the perimeter of the property with flashlights as darkness fell. They found boot prints near the barn that matched the size of the ones I had seen weeks earlier. They told us this was now being treated as stalking and trespassing, that they would have someone drive by every few hours, and that we should not hesitate to call 911 if we saw or heard anything suspicious. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jolt awake. The house settling, the wind in the corn, a bird calling in the darkness. I kept thinking about those binoculars pointed at the house. How long had this person been watching? What had they seen? What did they want? The questions cycled through my mind until dawn finally came, and I gave up on sleep entirely. My grandmother suggested I call my parents and go home, that she could hire someone local to finish the summer work. But I refused. I was not going to leave her alone on this property with some creep lurking in the fields. Instead, I called my friend Marcus, who lived 2 towns over, and asked him to come spend a few days with us. Marcus was a football player, built like a truck, and having another person around made me feel slightly less vulnerable. He arrived that afternoon with his own sleeping bag and a baseball bat, treating the whole thing like an adventure. Though I could tell he was taking it seriously when he saw how rattled I was. That evening, Marcus and I decided we would take turns staying up through the night to keep watch. We sat on the porch with the outside lights on, watching the edge of the cornfield that started just 40 yards from the house. My grandmother had gone to bed around 10, and Marcus and I played cards and talked quietly, listening. Around 11:30, we both heard it. Movement in the corn, not the random rustling of wind, but deliberate rhythmic sounds. Something moving through the stalks parallel to the house. Marcus grabbed the baseball bat. I grabbed the flashlight and my phone with 911 already dialed, my thumb hovering over the call button. We stood at the edge of the porch, aiming the flashlight toward the sounds. For a moment, everything went silent. Then we saw him, just for a second, between the rows, maybe 30 feet away. A figure, tall, wearing dark clothes, standing completely still, facing the house, facing us. I hit the call button. Marcus yelled something. I do not even remember what. The figure turned and disappeared deeper into the corn, moving fast. The police arrived within 10 minutes. 4 deputies this time, taking it seriously now. They searched with floodlights and a tracking dog they had brought. 2 hours later, they found another campsite. This one even deeper in the field on the northern boundary of the property. This one had more personal items. A backpack with clothing. A wallet with an ID. That is how we learned his name was Richard Paulman, age 43, with a last known address in Nebraska. That is also how we learned he had a criminal record. Multiple counts of stalking, 1 charge of attempted breaking and entering. He had been released from prison 8 months earlier. The police took it very seriously after that. They brought in additional officers and spent the entire next day searching every inch of those 200 acres. They never found him. He was gone, vanished like he had never been there, though his belongings proved he had been living in our field for at least a month, possibly longer. The police theorized he had been watching the property, learning the patterns, maybe planning to break into the house when he felt ready. They said we were lucky I had found that first campsite when I did, because it escalated their response before he could act on whatever he was planning. Richard Paulman was never caught. A warrant was issued. His information was entered into every database, but he disappeared. For all I know, he is still out there somewhere, living in someone else's field, watching someone else's family. That thought keeps me awake sometimes, even now, 3 years later. I finished the summer at my grandmother's farm because I refused to let fear drive me away. But I was never comfortable again. Every time I went into that cornfield to work, my heart rate would spike. Every sound made me turn around. Every evening I felt eyes on me, even though I knew rationally he was probably hundreds of miles away. My grandmother sold the farm the following spring. She said it was time to retire, that she was getting too old for the work anyway. But I know the real reason. That man took away her sense of safety in the place she had lived for 50 years. The new owners harvested the corn, plowed the fields, and eventually subdivided the property for development. Houses stand there now, suburban homes with neat lawns and swing sets. I wonder if those families have any idea what happened in that field. I wonder if they would care. To this day, I cannot walk through tall corn without my heart racing. The rational part of my brain knows that what happened was a statistical anomaly, that millions of people work in cornfields every year without incident. But the primal part, the part that remembers finding that campsite and seeing those binoculars pointed at my home, that part knows the truth. Cornfields are not just crops. They are perfect hiding places. And sometimes something is hiding there, watching, waiting. You just have to hope you never find out what it wants. I need to start by saying that I am not someone who believed in ghosts or the paranormal before this happened. I was a skeptic, the kind of person who rolled her eyes at ghost hunting shows and thought every unexplained sound had a logical explanation. That confidence is gone now. What I experienced in the cornfield behind my uncle's farm was real, and 3 years later, I still cannot explain it. My name is Evelyn, and I learned the hard way that some places hold on to things that should have been buried and forgotten. In August of 2022, my uncle David passed away suddenly from a heart attack at the age of 68. He had never married and had no children, so his 240-acre farm in central Nebraska passed to my mother, his only sibling. My mother had no interest in farming and lived 800 miles away in Denver. So the plan was to sell the property as quickly as possible. She asked me if I would be willing to spend a few months living at the farmhouse, getting it ready for sale, managing the final harvest with the help of local contractors, and basically serving as the family representative during the transition. I had just finished my master's degree and was between jobs, so I agreed. It seemed like a good opportunity to have some quiet time to figure out my next career move. And my uncle had always been kind to me during the few times we had visited when I was younger. I arrived at the farm on a humid Tuesday afternoon in early September. The house was a classic 2-story farmhouse that had been built in the 1920s, white clapboard with green shutters and a wraparound porch. It needed work, but was structurally sound. The cornfield stretched behind the house, row after row of tall green stalks that reached well over my head, ready for harvest in another few weeks. My first week was spent cleaning the house, sorting through my uncle's belongings, and meeting with the agricultural contractor who would handle the harvest. Everything was straightforward and exactly what I expected. On my 8th night there, I woke up to the sound of a child crying. It was faint but distinct, coming from outside. I checked my phone and saw it was 12:17 in the morning. My first thought was that a neighbor's child was lost or hurt, though I knew the nearest house was over a mile away. I got out of bed, went to the window, and looked out at the backyard and the cornfield beyond. The crying continued. A little girl by the sound of it, sobbing with that gulping, breathless quality children have when they are truly upset. The sound was coming from the cornfield. I did not even hesitate. I grabbed my phone for the flashlight, pulled on shoes, and went outside in my pajamas and a sweatshirt. The September night was cool, and fog was beginning to form in the low areas of the property. I stood at the edge of the cornfield, sweeping my phone's flashlight beam across the first few rows, and called out, asking if anyone was there. The crying stopped for a moment, then started again, deeper in the field. I followed it. Walking into a cornfield at night is disorienting. The rows all look identical, and once you are more than 10 or 15 feet in, you lose sight of any landmarks. The corn walls close around you, blocking out the moonlight, and your world shrinks to the narrow corridor between the stalks. I kept my phone light aimed forward and followed the sound of the crying, which seemed to move away from me as I walked. I called out several more times, identifying myself, saying I was here to help, asking the child to stay where she was. The crying would pause when I spoke, then resume, always just ahead of me. I followed that sound for what felt like 20 minutes. Later, when I checked the timestamp on my phone, I realized it had been closer to 45 minutes. I was deep in the field, completely turned around with no clear idea which direction the house was, when the crying suddenly stopped. Just cut off in the middle of a sob. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no insects, no rustling corn, just crushing, oppressive silence that made my ears ring. That is when the fear hit me. I realized I was alone in the middle of a dark cornfield in the middle of the night, and I had no idea how to get back. I tried to retrace my steps, but quickly realized I had made too many turns following the sound. I used my phone's compass app to head generally west toward where I thought the house should be, pushing through rows and trying not to panic. It took me nearly an hour to find my way out. And when I finally emerged, I was on the far eastern edge of the property, over half a mile from the house. I was scratched up, exhausted, and thoroughly shaken. I walked back along the road, and when I got inside, I locked every door and window and did not sleep the rest of that night. The next morning in the daylight, I convinced myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe I had heard an animal. Foxes can make sounds that are eerily similar to human crying. Maybe I had been half asleep and disoriented. Maybe my grief over my uncle's death had manifested in some strange way. I told myself I would not go into that field at night again, and that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time I woke to the sound of an elderly woman calling my name. Not yelling, but calling in that gentle way someone might call a child to dinner. "Evelyn, honey, come here. Evelyn, I need you." The voice was coming from the cornfield. I stayed in bed this time, covers pulled up to my chin, listening to that voice call my name over and over for nearly 20 minutes before it finally stopped. I did not sleep the rest of that night either. The following night, a teenage boy's voice called from the field, shouting for help. The night after that, I heard my mother's voice, which was impossible because I had spoken to her on the phone that very evening, and she was in Colorado. Every night brought a different voice, always around midnight, always coming from the cornfield. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. I was exhausted and on edge, and I started researching the property's history. What I found made everything worse. The farm had been in operation since 1873, established by homesteaders after the Homestead Act. But before that, the land had been part of a pioneer trail. And before that, it had been used by native peoples for generations. In 1876, a family of settlers who had made camp near what was now the cornfield were killed by what the historical records called unknown assailants. 7 people, including 3 children. In 1912, a field worker died of heat stroke and his body was not found for 3 days, having fallen between the corn rows. In 1948, a young woman disappeared from a neighboring farm, and her remains were found in the cornfield 5 months later. The police never determined if it was foul play or if she had gotten lost and succumbed to exposure. I found references to the voices going back to at least the 1960s. A local historian had collected oral histories from longtime residents, and several of them mentioned hearing calls from the cornfield at night. They described the same experience I was having. Voices of people they knew, voices of children, voices that led you deeper into the field and then vanished. At least 2 people had gotten lost following the voices and had to be rescued the next morning. No one could explain it. The local folklore said the field was built over an old burial ground, though I could not find any documentation to confirm that. I should have left. I should have packed my things and gone back to Denver and told my mother to hire someone local to handle the farm. But I was stubborn, and I told myself I was not going to be driven away by what was probably just audio pareidolia and my overactive imagination working on local superstition. So I stayed, and then I saw it. It was a Friday night, 2 weeks after the voices had started. I was sitting on the porch around 9 in the evening, drinking tea and trying to calm my nerves before bed, when I heard my father's voice. My father, who had died 6 years earlier from cancer, his voice calling from the cornfield. saying my name exactly the way he used to. "Evelyn Rose, come help your old man with something." That was his phrase. Come help your old man. I stood up, hands shaking, and walked to the edge of the porch. I was not going to follow it into the field. I had learned that lesson. But I wanted to see if I could determine where the sound was coming from. I stood there watching the darkening cornfield, and that is when I saw movement. Something was moving through the corn about 30 yards out, pushing stalks aside as it walked parallel to the house. But the way it moved was wrong. It was too tall, taller than the corn, which was over 7 feet high. And the shape was wrong. The silhouette was elongated and thin, not matching any human proportions I recognized. I watched it move from right to left across my field of vision, always staying deep enough in the corn that I could not see it clearly, just the movement of the stalks being pushed aside. My father's voice kept calling my name, but now I could see the voice was not coming from where the thing was moving. The voice was some kind of lure, and whatever that thing was in the corn was what was making it. I went inside, locked the doors, and sat in the living room with every light on until dawn. The next day I called a local pastor whose number I found in my uncle's address book. I explained what was happening, expecting him to think I was crazy. Instead, he sighed and said he had heard similar stories about that property for years. He offered to come and bless the house, which he did. But he told me honestly that he did not think it would help. The field itself was the problem, he said, and had been for longer than anyone could remember. Some places hold on to pain and tragedy, he told me, and they play it back like a recording. He suggested I have the corn harvested as soon as possible and considers selling the property to someone who would put it to a different use. I took his advice. I called the agricultural contractor and told him I wanted the harvest moved up immediately, that I would pay extra to make it a priority. He agreed, and 4 days later, his crew arrived with their equipment. Watching them harvest that corn felt like watching something be exercised. The combines moved through the field in methodical lines, cutting everything down, and with each pass, I felt a weight lifting. The work took 2 full days. By the end, the cornfield was nothing but stubble. And that night, for the first time in 3 weeks, I heard nothing. No voices, no calling, just silence. I stayed for another month to finish getting the house ready for sale. Without the corn, the property felt different, normal. I slept through the night. Birds came back to the yard. It was like whatever had been there was finally gone, or at least dormant. My mother sold the farm in November to a developer who planned to subdivide it for residential housing. The cornfield is gone permanently now, replaced with roads and building lots. I moved back to Denver and started a new job in January. I told myself I was fine, that I had gotten through a difficult experience and come out the other side. But I still cannot drive past a cornfield without feeling a tightness in my chest. And sometimes, late at night when I'm falling asleep, I hear my father's voice calling my name from very far away. I know it is not real. I know he is gone and at peace. But some part of me wonders if I brought something back with me from that field. Some small echo of whatever was calling out there in the dark. I try not to think about it too much. I try to focus on the fact that I got out, that I survived. But the truth is, I will never be completely sure I left everything behind in that cornfield in Nebraska. Some things follow you, whether you can see them or not. My car broke down on Route 34 at 11:45 on a Tuesday night. And what happened in the next 2 hours taught me that the most dangerous predators are the ones who know how to hunt in darkness. This is the story of how I barely escaped with my life. My name is Nathan, and 5 years ago, I was 26 years old, driving cross-country from Colorado to Pennsylvania for a new job. I had been on the road for 2 days, trying to save money by driving straight through instead of paying for hotels. It was a stupid decision motivated by financial stress and overconfidence in my 10-year-old sedan. I was somewhere in rural Nebraska, a stretch of 2-lane highway that cut through endless farmland, when my engine started making a sound like marbles in a blender. Within 30 seconds, the check engine light came on. The temperature gauge spiked into the red, and I barely managed to pull onto the shoulder before the whole thing died. I sat there in the sudden silence, my hazard lights blinking weakly, and assessed my situation. It was nearly midnight. I had not seen another car in over 20 minutes. My phone showed 1 bar of signal that kept flickering to no service. The last town I had passed was at least 15 miles back. On both sides of the road, cornfields stretched into the darkness, the stalks tall enough that I could not see past them. The corn was late-season growth, probably ready for harvest in a few weeks, standing at least 8 or 9 feet tall and forming solid walls that blocked any view of what might lie beyond. I tried calling for a tow truck, but the call kept dropping. I tried texting my brother to let him know where I was, but the message would not send. After 20 minutes of attempting to get help with no success, I made the decision to walk. I remembered seeing a farmhouse light maybe 2 or 3 miles back. If I walked at a decent pace, I could reach it in 40 minutes, use their phone, and get help. Sitting in a dead car on a dark highway, waiting for someone to come along seemed more dangerous than walking. I grabbed my phone, my wallet, and a flashlight from the glove box, locked the car, and started walking back the way I had come. The road was completely dark except for my flashlight beam. No streetlights, no house lights visible anywhere, just my small circle of illumination and the vast darkness beyond it. The corn rustled in the night breeze, a sound that should have been peaceful but instead felt menacing in the isolation. I walked on the shoulder, my flashlight pointed ahead, trying to remember exactly how far back that farmhouse had been. Had it been 2 miles or 4? In a car, distances are deceptive. I had been walking for maybe 15 minutes when I saw headlights approaching from behind me. Relief flooded through me. I turned and waved my flashlight, flagging down the vehicle. It was a pickup truck, dark-colored, moving slowly. But instead of stopping when it reached me, it passed by at maybe 5 miles per hour, the driver's face hidden in shadow. I called out to it, waving, but it just continued down the road for another 100 feet. Then the brake lights came on. The truck stopped. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The truck just sat there, brake lights glowing red in the darkness. Then the reverse lights came on and it started backing up toward me. Something about the way it moved, slow and deliberate, made my stomach clench. This was not someone being helpful. This was something else. I did not wait to find out what. I turned and ran into the cornfield. I crashed through the first few rows of corn, stalks slapping my face and arms, my flashlight beam jerking wildly. Behind me, I heard the truck stop on the road, heard doors opening, heard voices. Male voices, at least 2 of them, maybe 3. One of them laughed. That laugh made my blood freeze. It was not the laugh of someone trying to help a stranded motorist. It was the laugh of someone who enjoyed watching prey run. I kept moving through the corn, trying to run between the rows instead of crashing through them, trying to move fast while staying quiet. The rows were planted in long, straight lines, which meant if I stayed in one row, they could see my flashlight beam from far away. I turned off the flashlight and relied on moonlight, which was almost non-existent under the canopy of corn leaves. I could barely see 3 feet in front of me. I tripped over the uneven dirt, caught myself, kept moving. Behind me, I could hear them entering the field. At least 2, maybe 3 people, not trying to be quiet, talking to each other in normal voices, like they were on a casual walk. That was almost worse than if they had been chasing me aggressively. The casualness of it suggested they knew something I did not. Maybe that the field was surrounded by road on all sides and I had nowhere to go. Maybe that they had done this before. I moved as quietly as I could, changing directions every few rows, trying to get deeper into the field. My heart was slamming in my chest so hard I thought it might burst. I could hear them spreading out, moving through different rows, searching in a grid pattern. One of them was getting closer to me. I crouched down, pressing myself against the corn stalks, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps came within maybe 20 feet of me, stopped, then moved in a different direction. I stayed frozen for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably only 2 or 3. When I could no longer hear them in my immediate vicinity, I started moving again, crawling on my hands and knees to stay below the corn line. My phone was in my pocket, but I did not dare turn it on for fear the screen light would give away my position. I kept moving in what I hoped was a direction away from the road, deeper into the field. Then I heard something that made me stop breathing entirely. An engine, not the truck engine. Something else. Something mechanical and closer. Raised my head just enough to see over the corn and spotted a light moving through the field. They had driven the truck off the road and into the corn, driving down between the rows with spotlights, searching for me. I could see the lights sweeping back and forth, maybe 100 yards away. I ran. I did not care about noise anymore. I crashed through the corn in pure panic, running perpendicular to the truck's path, trying to get distance before those lights found me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. And then I saw it. A driveway. A gap in the corn that led to a gravel driveway that led to a dark farmhouse. I sprinted toward it, my legs finding energy I did not know I had left. The truck's engine sound changed pitch. They had seen me. The lights were turning in my direction. I ran down the driveway and threw myself behind a metal storage shed next to the dark house, pressing myself against the corrugated metal wall, gasping for air. I heard the truck stop at the end of the driveway. The engine idled. Doors opened. I was trapped. The house was dark. No one was home, or they were asleep, and I did not have time to wake them. The shed blocked me from view of the driveway, but if they came down and searched, they would find me in seconds. I looked around desperately and spotted a large propane tank 10 feet away, closer to the house. I crawled to it and pressed myself behind it, making myself as small as possible. I heard footsteps on gravel. 2 people walking down the driveway. They were talking quietly, words I could not make out. They were maybe 30 feet away, 20 feet. The footsteps stopped. One of them said something about checking the house. The other one laughed again, that same terrible laugh. Time seemed to stop. I was certain they were going to find me. Certain this was how I was going to die, in some stranger's yard, killed by people whose faces I had never even seen. Then, from the direction of the road, a third voice called out. Urgent, something about lights. The footsteps on the gravel hesitated, then turned and moved quickly back toward the truck. Doors slammed. The engine revved and the truck pulled away fast, gravel spraying. I waited behind that propane tank, not moving, barely breathing, for what felt like an hour, but my phone later told me was 20 seconds. When I finally dared to look, the truck was gone. I could see tail lights in the distance, moving away down Route 34. I stayed hidden for another full 10 minutes, making sure they were really gone and not coming back. When I finally stood up on shaking legs, I vomited in the grass next to the propane tank. Fear and adrenaline and exhaustion all hitting me at once. I walked to the dark farmhouse and pounded on the door until lights came on inside. An elderly couple answered, understandably terrified by the filthy, wild-eyed man on their porch at 1 a.m. I told them I needed to call the police, that someone had chased me through the cornfield. They let me in and called 911 while the wife made me sit down and brought me water. The police arrived 30 minutes later. I told them everything. They found my car still on the shoulder of Route 34, untouched. They searched the cornfield with flashlights and found tire tracks where the truck had driven into the field, found the trampled corn where multiple people had been walking around, found my footprints and other footprints. But they never found who had chased me. The truck had vanished. The deputy who took my statement told me I was the 4th person in 2 years to report being chased in that area after their car broke down or they stopped for some other reason. None of the other victims got away. 2 were found beaten nearly to death and robbed. 1 was never found at all. The deputy said they suspected it was a group targeting stranded motorists, possibly even sabotaging cars to create victims. But they had never caught anyone. He said I was lucky. I did not feel lucky. I felt like I had looked into something dark and barely escaped. My car was towed to a shop in the nearest town. The mechanic told me my coolant line had been cut cleanly, not worn through or damaged by age. Someone had sabotaged my car. I paid to have it fixed and continued my drive east, but I could not stop shaking for days. That was 5 years ago, and I still cannot drive through rural areas at night without my heart rate spiking. I keep my car meticulously maintained. I never let my gas tank get below half full. And if I see a pickup truck approach slowly on an empty highway, even in broad daylight, I feel that same cold panic. Because I know now that there are people who hunt other people, who use the isolation of cornfields and dark roads to their advantage, and who laugh while they do it. I survived because I ran fast and got lucky. That is all. And knowing how close I came to being one of the ones who did not get away haunts me every single day. When I was 19 years old, I stumbled upon something in a cornfield that I was never meant to see. What started as innocent curiosity during a boring house-sitting job turned into one of the most terrifying nights of my life. And it taught me that some traditions are kept secret for very good reasons. My name is Zoe, and this is what happened when I discovered the Circle People. In the summer of 2020, I agreed to house sit for a family friend named Mrs. Garrett, who lived about 40 minutes outside of my hometown in southern Indiana. She was going to visit her daughter in Ohio for 2 weeks and needed someone to water the plants, feed the cat, and generally keep an eye on the place. The pay was decent, and I had nothing else going on between college semesters, so I said yes. The house was a modest ranch-style home on the edge of a small farming community, surrounded by fields. Behind the house was a massive cornfield that seemed to stretch on forever, owned by a neighboring farmer who leased the land. The first few days were uneventful and honestly pretty boring. I watched television, read books, played with Mrs. Garrett's ancient tabby cat, and tried not to lose my mind from the isolation. On the 4th day, I decided to explore the property a bit. There was a walking path that ran along the edge of the cornfield, probably used by Mrs. Garrett for her evening walks, and I followed it just to get some exercise and fresh air. The corn was at full height, maybe 8 feet tall, creating dense green walls on my left as I walked. After about 10 minutes, I noticed something odd. There was a gap in the corn. like a pathway leading into the field. Curious, I followed it. The path wound through the corn for maybe 50 feet before opening into a perfectly circular clearing. Someone had removed all the corn plants in a circle roughly 30 feet in diameter, leaving bare dirt. But it was not just an empty circle. Someone had drawn symbols in the dirt with what looked like chalk or paint. Geometric patterns, circles within circles, lines radiating from the center. And arranged around the perimeter of the circle were children's toys. Old ones, weathered by time and exposure. A stuffed rabbit with one ear missing, a wooden doll with a painted face, a set of jacks, a jump rope coiled like a snake, maybe 15 or 20 items total, each placed deliberately at even intervals around the circle's edge. I stood at the edge of this clearing, my phone already out, taking pictures. It was strange and definitely gave me an uneasy feeling. But I was more curious than scared. I figured it was some kind of art project, or maybe a memorial of some sort. I walked around the circle, photographing the symbols and the toys, trying to make sense of the patterns. Then I heard a twig snap behind me, and I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the corn swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. I decided I had seen enough and, meek, followed the path back to the house. That evening, I showed the photos to my friend Bailey, who had grown up in the area. We were video chatting, and I was telling her about my boring house-sitting gig when I remembered the circle. I pulled up the photos and showed them to her. Her face went pale. She leaned closer to her screen, studying the images. And then she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her before. Fear mixed with something like reverence. She asked me where exactly I was staying, and when I told her, she closed her eyes and said one word: crap. Bailey proceeded to tell me about what locals called the Circle People. She said it was a group in the area that practiced what they claimed were old harvest traditions, rituals that predated modern farming and had roots in European folk practices brought over by the original settlers. Most people in town knew about them, but did not talk about them much. They were secretive and very protective of their practices. And while they were generally considered harmless, there were stories. Stories about people who interfered with their ceremonies having bad luck. Crops failing, houses burning down. Nothing that could be proven, but enough that people knew to leave them alone. Bailey told me to stay away from that circle, to not go back there, to definitely not touch anything or disturb the setup. I promised her I would not, but I could not stop thinking about it. That night, I kept looking out the back window at the cornfield, wondering what those symbols meant, what those toys represented. Around midnight, I finally went to bed, but I had trouble sleeping. The house was so quiet, and every small sound seemed amplified. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to something that made my blood run cold. Chanting. Low, rhythmic chanting coming from outside. Multiple voices speaking in unison. Words I could not make out, but that had a cadence, like a prayer or incantation. I got out of bed and went to the window that faced the cornfield. In the distance, maybe 200 yards out where I knew the circle was located, I could see lights. Flickering orange lights like torches or candles. I counted at least 10, maybe more, and I could see figures moving around them, dark shapes against the firelight. The chanting continued, rising and falling in volume, and I realized with a sick feeling that some of those figures were small. Children. There were children out there in that field in the middle of the night, participating in whatever this ceremony was. I should have closed the curtains, gone back to bed, pretended I had not seen anything. That is what a smart person would have done. Instead, I grabbed my phone and started recording video through the window. zooming in as much as I could on the distant lights and figures. I recorded for maybe 30 seconds, trying to keep my hands steady, trying to capture evidence of what I was witnessing. Then my phone's camera flash went off. I had not realized the flash was on automatic, trying to compensate for the low light. The bright white flash lit up the interior of the room behind me, and consequently, my reflection was visible in the window. For a moment, I just stood there in shock, staring at my phone in horror. Then I looked back toward the field. The chanting had stopped, complete silence, and the figures, all of them, had turned toward the house. I could not see their faces at that distance, but I could see the shift in their body positions, all oriented in my direction now, all of them looking toward the window where I stood. I dropped to the floor below the window line, my heart slamming in my chest. I stayed there for maybe 2 minutes, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Then I heard them. Footsteps outside. Multiple people walking toward the house. Not running, not rushing, just walking with steady, purposeful steps. I crawled to the front door and checked that it was locked. It was. I checked the back door. Locked. I went through the entire house in a crouch, checking every window, every entry point, making sure everything was secure. The footsteps got louder, closer. They were in the backyard now. I called 911, but when the dispatcher answered and asked what my emergency was, I froze. What was I going to say? That people were having a ceremony in a cornfield and I spied on them? That they were walking toward the house? They had not threatened me. They had not tried to break in. I would sound insane. I hung up without saying anything. The footsteps stopped right outside the back door. I could hear breathing. Multiple people standing just on the other side of the door, so close I could hear the slight wheeze of someone's inhale. Then silence. I spent the next 4 hours huddled in the basement with all the lights off and a kitchen knife in my shaking hands, certain they were going to break in, certain something terrible was about to happen. But nothing did. No one tried the doors. No one broke a window. As the sky started to lighten with the approach of dawn, I finally worked up the courage to look outside. The backyard was empty. I went to the window that faced the cornfield and looked out. In the distance, the circle was invisible from this angle, but I knew it was there. Everything looked normal in the early morning light. When full daylight came, I went outside. My legs were weak and I felt nauseous from fear and lack of sleep. But I had to see. I walked around the house looking for evidence that people had been there. I found footprints in the soft dirt near the back door. Many footprints, different sizes including small ones, that could only have been from children. I followed the back path toward the cornfield, toward where the circle had been. When I reached the spot, I found that the path into the field had been covered. Someone had bent the corn stalks back across the entrance, hiding it. I pushed through anyway, forcing my way in, and emerged into the clearing. The circle was gone, not just cleaned up, but obliterated. The dirt had been raked smooth, erasing all the symbols. The toys were gone. Every trace of what had been there was removed as if it had never existed, except for one thing. Carved into the dirt in the very center of the circle, in letters 6 inches tall, was a message. Watcher beware. I ran back to the house, packed my things in less than 10 minutes, loaded them into my car, and left. I called Mrs. Garrett from the road and told her I had a family emergency and could not finish the house-sitting job. I gave her the name of another friend who could take over and apologized profusely. She was understanding and told me not to worry about it. I never told her the real reason I left. When I got home, I found that the video I had recorded on my phone was corrupted. The file would not open. The photos I had taken of the circle earlier in the week were fine, but that video from the night of the ceremony was just gone, replaced by a corrupted file that my phone could not read. I still have those photos of the circle on my phone. Sometimes I look at them and try to convince myself it was all some kind of misunderstanding, that I overreacted to a harmless local tradition. But then I remember the message carved in the dirt. Watcher beware. Those words were not a misunderstanding. They were a warning. Mrs. Garrett came home from her trip and never mentioned finding anything strange. My friend who took over the house-sitting job said the rest of the 2 weeks were completely uneventful. Life went on as normal for everyone except me. I moved back to college in the fall and tried to put the whole experience behind me. But I never went back to that area. When Bailey invites me to visit, I always make an excuse. And I never, ever go near cornfields anymore, especially during harvest season, because I know now that there are people who practice traditions in the shadows, rituals that the rest of us are not meant to see. And if you do see them, if you witness what you should not have witnessed, they will make sure you know that you have crossed a line. I got off with a warning. I do not want to know what would have happened if I had pushed further or gone back. Some mysteries are meant to stay buried in the corn. I was 22 years old when I took a summer job that would haunt me for the rest of my life. What I discovered working as a farmhand in eastern Kansas taught me that evil does not always announce itself with violence or threats. Sometimes it hides behind a quiet smile and a firm handshake. And by the time you see the truth, you are already standing on top of graves you did not know existed. My name is Dylan, and I worked for a serial killer without knowing it. The job posting appeared on a bulletin board at the agricultural supply store in Junction City in late May. Farmhand needed for summer season, it read. Room and board provided, competitive wages, experience preferred but not required. I had grown up around farms and needed money before heading back to college in the fall, so I called the number. A man named Patrick answered, his voice calm and measured. He asked a few basic questions about my experience, whether I could operate equipment, whether I had any health issues that would prevent heavy labor. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, and at the end, he told me the job was mine if I wanted it. I said yes. I arrived at the farm on a Tuesday afternoon. The property was about 15 miles outside of town, accessible by a long gravel driveway that wound through fields of young corn, already knee-high in the early summer heat. The house was a simple 2-story farmhouse, white paint peeling in places, but structurally sound. Patrick met me on the porch. He was in his mid-50s, lean and weathered from years of outdoor work, with graying hair cut short and hands that were calloused but clean. He shook my hand firmly, showed me to the converted barn where I would be staying, and gave me a brief tour of the operation. He ran a corn and soybean farm on just over 400 acres. Most of the work was mechanized, but he needed help with equipment maintenance, irrigation management, fence repair, and general labor during the growing season. He was polite, but not overly friendly. The kind of employer who respected boundaries and expected the same in return. I liked that. Some people talk your ear off. Patrick let the work speak for itself. The first 3 weeks were exactly what I expected. I woke at dawn, worked until mid-afternoon when the heat became oppressive, took a break, then worked another few hours in the evening when it cooled down. Patrick paid me in cash every Friday, and we ate dinner together most nights, simple meals he cooked himself. He was a decent cook and a quiet companion. We talked about weather, crop prices, equipment breakdowns. He never asked about my personal life, and I did not ask about his. It was a professional arrangement that suited us both. The only odd thing I noticed was how particular he was about one section of the property. The North Field, about 80 acres of corn separated from the main operation by a tree line, was off limits. He told me during my first week that the North Field was on a different planting schedule and was not ready for any kind of maintenance yet. Fair enough. I did not question it. Farmers have their systems, and I was not there to second-guess his methods. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. In my fourth week, I was repairing fence posts on the western boundary when I noticed that the corn in the North Field looked identical to the corn in the main fields. Same height, same color, same stage of growth. It did not make sense that it would be on a different schedule. I mentioned it casually to Patrick that evening over dinner. His face did not change, but something in his eyes shifted. He told me firmly that the North Field was his concern and I should focus on my assigned work. The conversation moved on, but I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. 2 days later, around 7 in the evening, I was walking back from checking an irrigation pump near the tree line when I saw Patrick. He was walking into the North Field carrying a large duffel bag over his shoulder, the kind of heavy canvas bag people use for camping gear or tools. He did not see me. I watched him disappear into the corn rows, moving with purpose toward the center of the field. It struck me as odd. Why would he need tools out there if the field was not being worked? I dismissed it. Maybe he was checking for pests or setting up monitoring equipment. But the image stuck with me. The following Monday, Patrick drove into town for supplies. He told me he would be gone most of the day and that I should focus on cleaning and organizing the equipment shed. After he left, I stood in the yard for a long time, looking toward the North Field. I knew I should not go out there. I knew it was a violation of trust and potentially my job. But something nagged at me, some instinct I could not name. I walked to the tree line, pushed through the brush, and entered the North Field. The corn was dense and uniform, planted in perfect rows just like everywhere else. I walked toward the center, navigating by the sun, listening for any sound that might indicate I was not alone. After about 10 minutes, I found it. A cleared area, roughly 20 feet in diameter, hidden deep in the corn where it could not be seen from any road or building. The ground had been disturbed. There were 3 distinct mounds of earth, each about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, covered with a thin layer of soil and dead leaves that had been carefully arranged to look natural. But the soil was loose, fresh. My stomach turned. I stood there staring at those mounds, and my brain tried to come up with innocent explanations. Dead livestock, old septic drainage, anything but what I was actually looking at. Then I saw it. Tied to one of the corn stalks at the edge of the clearing was a clear plastic bag. Inside were personal items, a wallet, a cell phone, a set of car keys, a woman's driver's license with a name I did not recognize, but a face that looked young and scared in the photo. I felt like I was going to vomit. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I took 3 photos of the clearing, 2 of the plastic bag, and then I ran. I crashed through the corn as fast as I could move, branches whipping my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I did not stop until I reached my truck parked near the barn. I sat in the driver's seat, locked the doors, and tried to think. I could not go to Patrick. If he was responsible for what I had found, confronting him would be suicide. I could not call from the farm phone in case he checked records. I needed to get to town, to call from somewhere public, somewhere safe. I started the truck and drove down the long gravel driveway, forcing myself to go slow, to not raise suspicion if Patrick happened to be coming back and we passed each other on the road. My heart did not stop pounding until I reached the main highway. I drove to the sheriff's office in Junction City and told them everything. The deputy who took my statement looked skeptical at first. But when I showed him the photos on my phone, his expression changed. Within an hour, there were 6 patrol cars heading to the farm. I rode with one of them, sitting in the back seat in silence, watching the fields roll past and wondering if I had just imagined the whole thing. We did not imagine it. The police cordoned off the north field and brought in cadaver dogs and excavation equipment. They found remains, 2 bodies buried in shallow graves, both victims who had been reported missing in the past 18 months. A transient laborer from Oklahoma, a hitchhiker passing through Kansas on her way to Colorado. People whose disappearances had been investigated but never solved because there were no leads, no witnesses, no connections. Patrick had chosen his victims carefully. People who would not be missed, who were far from home, who could vanish without raising immediate alarm. Patrick Ellis was arrested that evening when he returned to the farm. He did not resist. He did not deny anything. According to the police, he confessed within 2 hours, providing details about 3 victims, explaining how he had lured them to the property with offers of work or help. How he had killed them and buried them in the field he knew no one would ever search. The case made state news for a few weeks, then faded as these things do. Patrick was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. I left Kansas the day after his arraignment. I could not stay on that property, could not look at those fields without seeing what was buried there. The family who owned the land sold it within 6 months. I heard they had the north field completely excavated and the soil removed, though I do not know if that is true. I do not ever want to go back and find out. What haunts me most is not the discovery itself, though that was terrible enough. What haunts me is the meals we shared, the conversations about weather and crop yields, the polite thank yous when I finished a job well done. I sat across a table from a man who had killed at least 3 people, maybe more, and I saw nothing. No signs, no red flags, no indication that anything was wrong. He was normal. He was kind. He paid me fairly and treated me with respect. And all the while, bodies were decomposing 200 yards from where I slept. I finished my degree and moved to Oregon, as far from the Midwest as I could get. I do not work in agriculture anymore. I cannot. Every time I see a cornfield, I think about what might be hidden in the rows, what secrets the soil might hold. I think about how easy it is for evil to hide in plain sight, how a quiet man with a firm handshake can be a monster, and how close I came to being the 4th body in that clearing. I got out because I was curious, because I asked questions, because I trusted my instincts when something felt wrong. Not everyone is that lucky. And that is what keeps me awake at night, knowing that somewhere, in some field, in some forgotten corner of farmland, there are probably more graves that no one has found yet, more victims of people who seem perfectly normal until the day you dig too deep and discover the truth they have been hiding all along. I spent 6 weeks convinced I was losing my mind, that my paranoia was a symptom of trauma and isolation rather than a genuine threat. I was wrong. My name is Audrey, and this is the story of how I learned to trust my instincts, even when everyone around me insisted I was imagining things. Sometimes what feels like paranoia is actually your brain recognizing danger before your conscious mind can process it. 2 years ago, I was 35 years old and freshly divorced after 8 years of marriage. The split was ugly, drawn out, and left me emotionally exhausted. My therapist suggested I take some time away from the city, Somewhere quiet where I could process everything and start rebuilding my sense of self. A colleague mentioned that her aunt had a small farmhouse for rent in rural Kansas, 2 bedrooms, completely furnished, month-to-month lease, utilities included, remarkably cheap. It sounded perfect. I wanted isolation. I wanted peace. I wanted to be somewhere my ex-husband could not find me, could not call me, could not show up unannounced demanding to talk. I signed the lease sight unseen and moved in on a gray Tuesday in early April. The house was exactly what I needed. A modest 1-story ranch from the 1960s, freshly painted white with blue trim, sitting on 5 acres at the end of a gravel road. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. Behind the house, on 3 sides, stretched a massive cornfield owned by a corporate farming operation. In April, the field was just tilled earth, dark and rich, waiting for planting. The silence was profound. No traffic noise, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls. Just wind and birds and the occasional distant rumble of farm equipment. I spent the first week unpacking, setting up my home office for remote work and slowly unwinding. I slept better than I had in months. The corn was planted in mid-April, and by early May the field had transformed into a sea of bright green shoots, maybe 6 inches tall and growing visibly day by day. I started taking my morning coffee on the back porch, watching the sunrise over the field, feeling something like contentment for the first time since the divorce. But around the 3rd week of May, something shifted. I started feeling watched. It began as a vague unease, the kind of prickling sensation you get when someone is staring at you in a crowded room. I would be sitting on the porch reading, and suddenly I would have the overwhelming urge to look up toward the northeast corner of the field. There was never anything there. Just rows of corn, now knee-high and rustling softly in the breeze. I told myself it was just hypervigilance, a normal response to being alone in an unfamiliar place after years of a controlling marriage. My therapist had warned me that I might experience heightened anxiety during this transition period. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling persisted and intensified. By early June, when the corn was chest-high and forming a proper wall around the property, I could barely spend time outside without feeling like something was observing me. It was always strongest in the evening, around 7:30, right as the sun was getting low. I would step onto the back porch and the sensation would hit me like a physical force. Eyes on me. Something watching from the field, specifically from the northeast corner, always the same spot. I started going outside less. I kept the curtains closed. When I mentioned it casually to my friend Rachel during a phone call, she gently suggested that maybe I was projecting my feelings about my ex onto the environment, that feeling watched was a manifestation of my hypervigilance during the marriage. She recommended I talk to my therapist about it. I did. My therapist suggested the same thing and asked if I wanted to try anxiety medication. I said I would think about it. The rational part of my brain agreed with them. Of course, I was being paranoid. I was a recently divorced woman living alone in the middle of nowhere, still processing years of emotional abuse. My nervous system was in overdrive. The feeling of being watched was psychological, not real. There was nothing in the cornfield. I needed to address my anxiety, not feed into irrational fears. But the primal part of my brain, the part that evolved over millions of years to keep humans alive, was screaming that something was wrong. I tried to prove to myself that it was all in my head. I set up my phone on the back porch one evening to record video of the northeast corner of the field while I stayed inside. I recorded for an hour, then reviewed the footage. Nothing. Just corn swaying in the wind. I felt foolish and a little relieved. See? Just anxiety. Nothing there. 3 days later, I did it again. this time positioning the phone to capture a wider angle. Again, nothing unusual in the footage. I was starting to feel better, more confident that this was indeed a psychological issue I could work through rather than a real external threat. I made an appointment with my doctor to discuss medication options. Then, on a Thursday evening in late June, I decided to confront my fear directly. The corn was now over 7 feet tall, forming dense walls that you could not see through. The feeling of being watched had become so strong that I was essentially hiding in my house every evening, curtains drawn, lights off, trying to be invisible to whatever I thought was out there. This was not sustainable. I needed to prove to myself, once and for all, that there was nothing in that field. At 7:15, right before the usual time when the feeling was strongest, I walked out the back door and marched directly toward the northeast corner of the property. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking, but I forced myself to keep walking. I was going to go right up to the edge of that cornfield, look into it, see that there was nothing there, and put this whole, ridiculous fear to rest. I made it about 30 feet from the corn when I saw it. A hunting blind, a camouflage ground blind, the kind hunters use to hide while waiting for deer, positioned just inside the first row of corn and angled directly toward my house, specifically toward the back porch and the large windows of my bedroom and bathroom. My legs went weak. I stood there staring at it, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. That had not been there when I moved in. That was not there in April or May. Someone had set that up recently, had positioned it deliberately to watch my house, to watch me. I took a step closer, then another, moving on autopilot even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. The blind was occupied recently. There were fresh cigarette butts on the ground outside it, at least 20 of them. Inside the blind, hung on the frame, were photographs, Polaroid pictures of me. Me on the back porch drinking coffee. Me getting my mail from the box at the end of the driveway. Me visible through my bedroom window, getting dressed. There were at least a dozen photos, maybe more. And there was other evidence of long-term occupation. A folding chair, empty water bottles, snack wrappers. Whoever had been using this blind had spent hours there. Days, probably. Watching me. I ran. I sprinted back to the house, my breath coming in gasps, fumbled with my keys, got inside, locked every door and window, and called 911 with hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I told the dispatcher there was someone stalking me, that I had found a blind with photos, that I needed police immediately. 2 sheriff's deputies arrived within 20 minutes. I showed them the blind, showed them the photos, told them about the weeks of feeling watched. They took photographs of everything, collected the Polaroids as evidence, and searched the surrounding area. They did not find anyone, but they found more evidence. Footpaths through the corn leading from a service road on the far side of the field. More cigarette butts. A recent campfire site. Someone had been coming and going regularly, accessing the blind from the road where their vehicle would not be visible from my house. The deputies asked if I had any idea who might be doing this. Ex-boyfriend? Angry ex-husband? I told them about my divorce, gave them my ex-husband's information. They ran his name and found that he had a brother, Thomas, who lived 2 counties over and had a record. Trespassing, stalking, peeping Tom charges. They brought him in for questioning that same night. Thomas confessed within hours. He had been staying with my ex-husband after my ex-husband and I separated. Had heard my ex-husband talking about me, complaining about the divorce, mentioning where I had moved. Thomas had decided, for reasons the police report described as obsessive and delusional, that he needed to watch over me. He had been coming to the property almost every day since mid-May, parking on the service road, walking through the corn, and spending hours in that blind watching my house. Watching me. The photos were his trophies. He had dozens more on his phone. He was arrested and charged with stalking, criminal trespass, and invasion of privacy. My ex-husband claimed he had no idea what his brother was doing, and there was no evidence to prove otherwise. Thomas accepted a plea deal. 18 months in county jail, 5 years probation, permanent restraining order. It felt like nothing compared to what he had put me through. But at least he was off the streets. I moved out of that farmhouse 3 days after finding the blind. I could not stay there, could not sleep there, knowing what had been happening just yards from my bedroom window. My friend Rachel apologized profusely for dismissing my concerns, for suggesting it was all in my head. My therapist apologized too. Everyone had been so ready to attribute my fear to trauma and mental health issues that no one had considered the possibility that I was actually in danger. The thing that haunts me most is not what Thomas did, though that is terrible enough. It is the fact that I almost convinced myself I was crazy. I almost went on medication to suppress the very instinct that was trying to protect me. If I had succeeded in medicating away that feeling of being watched, if I had managed to ignore it completely, how much longer would he have escalated? The police found journal entries on his phone detailing his fantasies about entering my house while I slept. I was weeks, maybe days, away from him acting on those fantasies. I live in an apartment complex now. 4th floor, neighbors on all sides, security cameras in the hallways. I have triple locks on my door and a security system. I see a new therapist who specializes in stalking victims. And I have learned, in the hardest way possible, that sometimes paranoia is not paranoia at all. Sometimes it is your subconscious recognizing patterns that your conscious mind has not put together yet. Sometimes that feeling of being watched is your brain's way of screaming at you that you are in danger, and you need to listen to it before it is too late. To this day, I cannot drive past a cornfield without feeling that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. But now, instead of dismissing it or trying to medicate it away, I pay attention. I trust it. Because the alternative, ignoring your instincts because you are afraid of seeming irrational or paranoid, can get you killed. I was lucky. I listened to that voice just in time. Not everyone does. And I think about that every single day, every time I see those tall green walls swaying in the wind, wondering who else might be hiding in the rows, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. Trust your instincts, even when everyone tells you it is all in your head, especially then,